Hey everyone, welcome back. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 971. Not only bidding farewell to others. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled as he looked at the young man who liked to ponder over matters again and again. When it came to vagrant cultivators, they wouldn't give a toss about anything, and they would hurriedly refine valuable treasures after obtaining them. When it came to official immortals with orderly inheritances, the seniors in the immortal force would help make plans for their juniors, and they would perhaps be even more earnest and careful than their disciples. You need to calm your mind before starting the refinement, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said. He then chuckled and joked. Do you still have any other treasures? Why don't you take them all out for me to look at? Chen Ping'an didn't hold back anymore, retrieving treasure after treasure from his minimization treasure. In the end, he even retrieved that Buddhist scripture that was only a single page. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon came to some sort of understanding when he saw the Buddhist scripture. He helped Chen Ping'an appraise the treasures, during which he picked up the exquisite round fan and gave it a gentle shake as if he were shaking off some dust. He smiled and handed the round fan to Chen Ping'an, saying, "Take another look at it." Chen Ping'an accepted the round fan, with the drawing on the fan still being that of a young lady holding a fan. Looking closely, however, he discovered that the small round fan in the young lady's hand also had a drawing of a young lady holding a fan. This was a drawing inside a drawing. Chen Ping'an paused for a moment before hurriedly closing his eyes, clenching a hand into a fist and lightly placing it against his glabella. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and said, "You can put it away now. Make sure to treasure it." He then placed the pair of Dragon King baskets in his sleeves and said, "These are far too damaged, so let me take them and repair them for you. I'm not trying to brag, but this is no longer a repair job that only costs a few immortal coins. Rather, these Dragon King baskets can only be repaired to their original state without damaging their essence through meticulous refinement, using a mixture of fire and water. It's best that you don't sell these small baskets, and if your mountains have large bodies of water in the future, you can use them to raise flood dragons and their kin. You have to understand that, apart from suppressing flood dragons, Dragon King baskets can also be treated as small dragon palaces. They're weapons in the hands of cultivators, and they're natural water palaces in the claws of flood dragons." Chen Ping'an bowed and thanked the old spiritual master. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon wanted to say something after Chen Ping'an put away all of his treasures, but he couldn't help but hesitate. He eventually smiled and asked, "This probably isn't a personal matter of yours. I understand now. Are you puzzled about my ground-lying peak?" Chen Ping'an could only muster his courage and reply, "Forgive my impudence, old spiritual master, but I think you can teach Zhang Shanfeng some loftier Dao abilities now." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon laughed heartily upon hearing this. Perhaps the cultivation bases of cultivators could be viewed as the most substantial immortal currency in the world. However, it was exactly because of this that Spiritual Master Fire Dragon didn't allow any of his disciples to make arguments using their cultivation bases at ground-lying peak. The old spiritual master never revealed the reason to any outsider. However, the young man in front of him couldn't be regarded as an outsider. Thus, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and asked, "Are you very curious about why I'm purposely hiding things from Shanfeng?" Chen Ping'an nodded in response. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon turned around and walked near the wall where Sword Immortal was hanging, explaining with a faint smile, "I only look at one's character and disposition when I'm taking disciples, and I don't consider one's aptitude at all. Who said immortal forces have to fight for so-called prodigies for the sake of accumulating wealth and influence? An immortal force might peacefully raise several kind-hearted lower 5-tier cultivators, or it might accidentally nurture a bastardly upper 5-tier cultivator. Which is better and which is worse?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon retracted his gaze. This was a good sword, but it was actually fighting with itself as well. As expected of Chen Ping'an. He turned around and said with a smile, "It's not because of my cultivation base that I'm able to say these things, but rather, it's because I've acted according to these principles and resolutely pursued Tao, cultivating both my strength and my heart, that I've been able to reach my current cultivation base." "Of course," Chen Ping'an concurred. "It's like I've planted a big tree at ground-lying peak, with this tree growing many branches and producing all kinds of different flowers and fruits. Some are high up and some are low down, and some bloom earlier and some ripen later. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon continued. Some people are limited by their aptitude, causing their branches and fruits to fall to the ground. For example, many of Zhang Shanfeng's senior brothers and senior sisters failed to overcome their cultivation barriers, and thus departed from the world. On the other hand, some of my disciples are indeed natural talents for cultivation, allowing them to live longer and attain greater Tao power. For example, the founders of the Profound Dawn branch, the Peach Mountain branch, the Secret Profound branch, and the White Cloud branch, among other branches. In my eyes, a disciple doesn't become impressive or special simply because their cultivation base is higher. The level of a person's Tao power isn't determined by their fists, but rather by their heart. Of course, having greater Tao power does indeed make speaking reason a bit easier. The reason might be the same, but it will seemingly appear more reasonable from the mouth of someone with greater Tao power. In reality, ground-lying peak is trying to stop this phenomenon from proliferating. From my point of view, many of my disciples who have already departed from this world were no inferior to the upper 5-tier cultivators of the White Cloud branch and the other branches. Their words and actions still live in my heart. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and continued. Be it the disciples who are cultivating at ground-lying peak or the disciples who have left ground-lying peak to establish their own mountains, I'll teach them different Tao techniques based on their character and disposition. Some disciples require scoldings from me to set them on the right path and take fewer detours, while others need a push from me to walk a bit quicker and become a bit braver. Generally speaking, however, it's me teaching them the basics and them walking the path of cultivation by themselves. Zhang Shanfeng is a bit different. Unlike ordinary masters teaching their disciples and making sure they understand things, there's no need for me to explicitly teach him. What I'm imparting unto Zhang Shanfeng is the most natural, allowing him to understand things by himself and ignore all other matters. Am I being selfish and showing favoritism? Yes and no. Do Zhang Shanfeng's senior brothers and senior sisters care about this? They don't think about it at all. This is ground-lying peak, where the disciples cultivate Tao and pursue truth. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and mused. Fundamentally speaking, is there any difference between a cultivator's view of cultivation bases, treasures, and fated opportunities and a mortal human's view of wealth, power, and fortune? If cultivators want to become genuine immortals in the mountains, they ultimately have to display some unique thoughts, no? Can one become a loftier immortal simply because their fist is stronger, their life is longer, and their immortal techniques are greater in number? If so, then there are truly a bit too many lofty immortals in the world. Chen Ping'an carefully ruminated over the old spiritual master's words. Some of the principles spoken by Spiritual Master Fire Dragon today could be directly borrowed and used as rules of downtrodden mountain in the future. Once your cultivation base reaches a great height and your renown grows, you'll naturally face an increasing number of complaints and criticisms from other people, with these outsiders wanting to teach you how to live, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said. He then smiled and offered some guidance, saying, that being the case, there are a few things you need to remember. Those in the present criticizing those in the past and those who are alive criticizing those who are dead are both cases of picking on people who can no longer speak up for themselves. So, firstly, you must not die, Chen Ping'an. And secondly, genuinely sinister people are actually most fond of the existence of good people. Only fools will wholeheartedly loathe good people, grumbling to heaven and earth all day long, dissatisfied that the good people aren't doing enough good deeds to a high enough standard. These people lack understanding, can't be taught, and refuse to change. Their brains are filled with mush, and their bodies radiate with hostility. In my eyes, these fools are the most impressive people in the world. I'm completely unable to deal with them. A great many principles spoken by people in the world are simply for the sake of winning arguments and achieving a sense of satisfaction, resulting in a tendency to speak in extremes. People are afraid that their principles will be too small and too lacking if they don't adopt extreme positions. These people are seemingly masters of principles and reason, but in reality, they're actually the most unreasonable. You need to be careful of these smart people. It's because of this that I sincerely admire the scholarly sage. When he speaks reason with other people, what's correct will be regarded as correct, and what's good will be regarded as good. Speaking reason is never a matter of fighting with other people. where victory is only achieved by using one's words to beat other people black and blue, and forcing them to kneel on the ground and beg for mercy. Rather, speaking reason is for the sake of finding common ground and obtaining mutual benefit. Even though Qian Pingyan hadn't spoken the entire time, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was now aware of a part of the answer regarding a certain speculation. This was already enough. These were good intentions with schemes and setups stretching thousands of kilometers and hundreds of thousands of years. As it turned out, one could also act as a Tao guardian in such a manner. By the looks of it, he had still been underestimating Qi Jingquan's knowledge and ability before. Sure enough, everyone in the scholarly sage's lineage was unbelievably protective of their own. Thus Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said something extremely meaningful and mystical, remarking, "Qian Pingyan, there are times when you might feel like you've comprehensively lost something, yet it's at these times that you've genuinely managed to obtain them. In this sense, some of your perceived disappointments are the cradle of other people's hopes." In the end, the old spiritual master patted the young man on the shoulder and said, "All right, you should strike the iron while it's hot and make haste to refine your third bonded item. I'll personally help you oversee things, and this is a privilege that ordinary cultivators don't even dare to dream of. Otherwise, won't you feel embarrassed to randomly wander around as a third-tier Qi refiner?" Qian Pingyan smiled wryly and commented, "Old spiritual master, didn't you just say that one shouldn't judge other cultivators according to their cultivation basis?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon chuckled. "But Qian Pingyan, you're not a cultivator from ground-lying peak." Qian Pingyan sighed in resignation. "I can't argue with that." The old spiritual master clicked his tongue in wonder and judged, "You're not very good at flattering people, young lad." "I'm indeed not very good at speaking," Qian Pingyan agreed with a nod. "You can just be a good person who has a clear conscience, even if you're beaten to a pulp," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said with a knowing smile. Die. With Spiritual Master Fire Dragon overseeing things, Paddling Island would find it difficult to experience trouble even if it wanted to. Qian Pingyan was refining his third bonded item in seclusion. Before this, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had first taught Qian Pingyan an ancient refinement mantra named Refining 3 Mountains, telling him to start with refining the Tao Power true intent of the 36 gray bricks, in order to strengthen his mountain shrine and transform it into a fundamental vein for his mountain range. However, Qian Pingyan surprisingly asked the old spiritual master whether he could refine only the true intent without refining the gray bricks. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon simply replied, "No problem," not asking Qian Pingyan what he wanted the 36 gray bricks for after they were stripped of their Tao intent and water fortune. The reason for refining the gray bricks first was that the aura released by the successful refinement of the wood element bonded item would be extremely significant otherwise. There wouldn't be too much commotion at the water palace, but the mountain shrine formed from the 5-colored soil of the eastern treasured Vile Continent's 5 mountains would inevitably be influenced by the aura. The 3 bonded items should complement each other and form a favorable situation, but if things went awry and they started to lose equilibrium, then Qian Pingyan would need to spend a huge amount of time and effort to repair his bonded items. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon couldn't afford to embarrass himself like this. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was genuinely someone from the pinnacle of the mountains, allowing him to clearly understand Qian Pingyan's current situation as he looked down from above. Looking at Qian Pingyan's water palace, there was already no need to ask for more, given the existence of the bonded water seal, the mural that had already taken shape but was yet to receive the most important stroke to breathe life into it, and the small pond. There were at most only 20 prodigies in the northern complete reed continent who possessed such impressive water palaces. Moreover, what was critical was the future growth of the small pond. When would the small pond transform into a deep pool, and when would the deep pool transform into a dragon pool? As for Qian Pingyan's bonded mountain shrine, the material used was relatively ordinary, but it was already no inferior to the materials used by the direct disciples in the ancestral halls of the sect-level immortal forces. In addition, it was advantageous in terms of its future potential. Even so, it ultimately couldn't compare to his water palace and his future wood residence. Qian Pingyan surprisingly used 10 entire days to refine the Tao intent and extract the water fortune of the 36 gray bricks. If it were the old spiritual master's disciples who had established their own mountains, 3 days would have presumably been enough. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon didn't think much of this. Some people walked earlier and walked quicker on the path of the Great Tao, but what was difficult was maintaining this pace as they ascended the mountains. As such, it was very common for some people to continually slow down as they kept walking forward. Even casting one's gaze over those prodigies who rapidly advanced from one tier to the next, not a single one of them was able to maintain their speed of breakthroughs after becoming Earth immortals. In fact, even Li Lu was no exception, lingering at the nascent tier for a decent period of time. It was necessary to slow down after advancing to the upper 5 tiers. However, there was an extremely small number of people who were different, continuing to speed up as they forged ahead. The former type of people were ordinary prodigies, while the latter type of people could make these ordinary prodigies suddenly feel like also-rans one day after being happy for many years. Chen Ping'an was busy cultivating. Meanwhile, Zhang Shanfeng hung around at Paddling Island, refining qi, practicing fist techniques and chatting with his master. Zhang Shanfeng opened the umbrella and strolled along the shore on a rainy day, and he came across a young man poking his head out of the water. This person asked him a very strange question, wondering whether Zhang Shanfeng would go crying to his master if he punched him once. Zhang Shanfeng squatted down beside the water and asked the young man whether this would be a light punch or a forceful punch. The young man was clearly bored and had nothing better to do, so he started to carefully discuss the power of the punch with the young Taoist priest. Water official Li Yuan felt like he had a chance after his discussion with Zhang Shanfeng. However, the young Taoist priest directly said, "I feel like it's necessary for me to ask my master for his opinion before I decide whether or not I face this punch." Li Yuan felt as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. He had secretly observed the young Taoist priest for the past few days, concluding that this person was quite simple and stupid. However, why wasn't he acting in a naive manner right now? "I'm just kidding." Zhang Shanfeng couldn't help but chuckle. "I've wandered around Paddling Island many times already, and I finally have someone else to chat with now." Li Yuan, who only had his head sticking out of the water, leaped onto the shore and sat cross-legged, placing his hands on his knees and asking, "Young Taoist priest, why is your cultivation base so pathetic even though you have such a good master?" Zhang Shanfeng smiled and replied, "My master can't cultivate in my stead." In fact, he had a nagging feeling that there was something wrong with the brain of this young man sitting beside him. Li Yuan swayed his head around, feeling a slight sense of pity for this fool from Ground-Lying Peak as he clicked his tongue in wonder and said, "You don't realize how lucky you are, young Taoist priest. Your aptitude is definitely very mediocre, or else anyone else would have already shot up to Golden Core tier or the nascent tier. You should cry and shout afterward and ask your master for a few valuable treasures. That way, you can do whatever you want when you travel outside the mountains, and the others will also have to refer to you as young master, no?" Zhang Shanfeng smiled faintly and replied, "I'm not bragging or blowing my own trumpet because I'm from Ground-Lying Peak, but with your attitude and temperament, I can tell you right now that you wouldn't qualify to become a Taoist priest at Ground-Lying Peak. Of course, each person has their own fate, so it's not necessarily a bad thing that you can't become a Taoist priest at Ground-Lying Peak. By the looks of it, you're one of the water gods in the Dragon Palace small world, correct? I'm quite envious of you, what with your innate mystical ability to travel through water. I'm fairly lacking in this regard, and I'm extremely slow when it comes to learning and cultivating immortal techniques with my master." Li Yuan shot a sideways glance at the young Taoist priest and sniggered. "But it seems like you don't feel any sense of urgency?" Zhang Shanfeng rolled his eyes and replied, "If being anxious is helpful, don't you think I would be anxious? Since I know it's not useful, then what's the point of being anxious? The old spiritual master definitely feels upset about taking a disciple as unbearably basic as you," Li Yuan said with a sigh. Zhang Shanfeng chuckled in response. Li Yuan became increasingly convinced that this young Taoist priest was a little fool. That being the case, spiritual master Fire Dragon could be regarded as a big old fool? Li Yuan felt quite satisfied as he thought about this, leading him to also chuckle with the young Taoist priest. However, it wasn't long before his smile froze. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was smiling with squinted eyes as he stood beside Zhang Shanfeng. Li Yuan stood up and said, "Congratulations on recruiting such an astonishingly talented disciple, old spiritual master. He's 1 in a million, and it won't be long before he attains the Great Tao. It won't be long at all." Perhaps this was the aspect where Li Yuan was more impressive than sect leader Sun Jia of the Water Dragon sect, including Sun Jia, the water god of Mirage Lake, and of course Li Yuan's colleague Shen Lin, who dared to speak to spiritual master Fire Dragon like this. Go and deliver a message to White Armor Island and Greybeard Island. Afterward, give a heads up to the Southern Fragrance Water Palace and say there's no need to worry about what happens next. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon instructed. This was a proper matter. Thus, water official Li Yuan no longer messed around as he nodded and transformed into specks of golden light, disappearing in a flash. He wasn't willing to show himself at White Armor Island and Greybeard Island, so the solution was very simple. He would tell Shen Lin and the Southern Fragrance Water Palace to deal with the mess. Li Yuan couldn't be bothered dealing with these matters that didn't pertain to the Plenty River and the incense offerings of the small world. Zhang Shanfeng noticed that it had stopped raining on Paddling Island again, so he closed the oil paper umbrella and said in a quiet voice, "Master, I feel like Paddling Island is quite strange. The rain at this place comes and goes without any warning." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded and remarked, "Shanfeng, your observation skills are quite sharp and in-depth. I learned this from Chan Pingyan," Zhang Shanfeng said with a smile. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and asked, "Then did Chan Pingyan learn anything from you?" Zhang Shanfeng thought about this question carefully before answering, "Crying poor and hungry? That's not bad either." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon chuckled. Around 15 minutes later, Zhang Shanfeng and Spiritual Master Fire Dragon sailed toward the Sea of Clouds on the talismanic boat that they had rented from the Water Dragon sect, peering down at Paddling Island from far away. Zhang Shanfeng suddenly saw a horse-drawn carriage charging out from the region of the lake between White Armor Island and Greybeard Island, with a female deity standing in front and seemingly channeling a mystical ability to funnel the spiritual energy of heaven and earth toward Paddling Island. With Chan Pingyan's temperament, he'll definitely remember this debt of gratitude for a long time if he learns of this water goddess' actions, Zhang Shanfeng suddenly said. Heaven and earth give birth to a myriad of matters and a myriad of people, and how to view heaven and earth is a profound question for cultivators. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said slowly. Take a table of food, for example. Some people will devour the food ravenously, some will eat and chew slowly, and some will express gratitude and remember the goodwill. These are ordinary people. Some people will pay the bill, afraid to have a debt of even a single copper coin. These are cultivators like us. There are also some people who will flip the table after eating, afraid that others might also enjoy the privilege of eating. However, the people behind them will exclaim that the table flippers are powerful beings, feeling a sense of respect and fear as they turn around to look for other tables of food. They'll emulate the powerful beings, insisting on slamming their chopsticks down and cursing, even if they're not able to flip the tables. Before leaving, they might even spit in the bowls and plates on the tables. Then there are some people who will pack away the bowls and chopsticks after standing up. However, they'll still be unwilling to leave straight away, and they'll even help to repair the shaky chairs and tables. Yet, the people waiting behind them will grumble in dissatisfaction, perhaps even walking over to kick them a few times. Zhang Shanfeng felt slightly baffled. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon sighed with emotion and remarked, "It's forever scholars whom the Confucian sages are most disappointed in. It's always cultivators who bring the most pollution to Tao, and it's always those chanting sutras who bring the most damage to the proper dharma of Buddhism. What can we do?" Zhang Shanfeng asked. "Have self-restraint, pursue truth, and cultivate oneself," the old spiritual master replied slowly. Zhang Shanfeng was racked with worry as he asked in a quiet voice, "And how is Chan Pingyan doing?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon thought for a moment before replying, "Qi Jingchuan's knowledge has never been ignored." "Does Chan Pingyan know?" Zhang Shanfeng asked. "He doesn't know," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon replied. "I feel like this is correct," Zhang Shanfeng suddenly said. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon faltered in a rare sight, and he focused his gaze and looked down before shaking his head and chuckling. It's a wooden residence in a small alley, yet a locust wood door has suddenly appeared from nowhere. This is quite unreasonable. The locust wood courtyard door to the small residence was half closed, and one could hear the faint sound of crying each time one walked past. There was a peach tree inside, though it was yet to grow leaves and yet to produce flowers. It was unknown when the soft crying that was seemingly knocking on the door of one's heart could gradually fade away. It was also unknown when one could meet the peach leaves and enjoy the peach blossoms. Perhaps it would be spring next year. Or perhaps it would be even further in the future. There was a lonely young man in azure standing outside the door of the small residence, dazedly looking toward a nearby area in the small alley. There was a child joyfully skipping home, exclaiming that he could soon enjoy a stick of tonghulu. Chen Ping'an was no longer a young boy, and he slowly raised a hand as if greeting the child. The carefree and innocent child stopped and cocked his head as he looked at the young man. In the end, the child seemingly failed to recognize this person in azure. However, the child also stopped shouting in joy, silently walking through the young man just like that. He then entered the small residence and closed the courtyard door. He left his older self standing outside the door. In the end, the child seemingly became a little older, appearing slightly taller and looking much more tan than before. He opened the door and walked out of the residence, carrying a large basket on his back. There were woks, bowls, utensils, medicine pots, and even torn and faded spring couplets. The child kept his head down, tightly gripping the ropes of the basket as he unsteadily left his residence in the small alley, only to never return. The commotion at Paddling Island was quite great. Water goddess Shenlin surprisingly needed to manipulate the water fortune and pay a personal visit to Paddling Island. Thankfully, the cultivators at White Armor Island and Greybeard Island had already received a warning from the Southern Fragrance Water Palace before, being told that some unconventional mighty figure was about to break through at Paddling Island. Two of water goddess Shenlin's trusted subordinate deities, a female lighting official and a water vein inspection official, were staying at White Armor Island and Greybeard Island respectively. They were giving face to these islands, and they were also watching over them at the same time. Atop the sea of clouds, Zhang Shanfeng asked, "Master, how long has it been already?" Chen Ping'an has clearly succeeded in refining his bonded item, so why is he still yet to return to his senses? He's keeping the doors shut to contemplate some matters. It's that simple, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon replied. When smart people get hung up on an issue, it's not very easy for them to let go. Either they backtrack along the same path, or they forcefully charge ahead and forge a new path. Li Yuan was sitting cross-legged in the distance, resting his cheeks in his hands as he breathed like a fish spitting bubbles. He was the mighty water official, yet he had somehow reached such a state of boredom. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon turned around and asked, "You're still playing around, Lord Li? Do you know what you let slip?" "I didn't miss any part of this show," Li Yuan replied. "I've been watching with my eyes wide open the entire time. Thankfully, deities don't have intestines like mortal humans," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said with a chuckle. Li Yuan rolled his eyes. The old Spiritual Master was implying that he would feel so much regret that his intestines would turn green? "Should I sell you a bottle of regret medicine?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked. "This is your only chance, so make sure to have a good think about it." Li Yuan's eyes darted around, thinking that this old geezer probably wouldn't stoop so low as to mess around with him due to boredom. Thus he asked, "What's the price?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and replied, "1 bottle of the highest grade water elixir from the Plenty River, and not the type used to deal with river gods in a perfunctory manner." Li Yuan bared his teeth and shook his head, replying, "Then I'm fine, old Spiritual Master. I genuinely can't offer a bottle of water elixir. After all, I still have to give 1 pill of water elixir to the Water Dragon sect every 10 years, regardless of how irresponsible I am." He would hand a pill to Sun Jie this decade, and he would offer a pill to Xiao Jingji the next decade, with the northern sect and the southern sect taking turns in receiving these pills of water elixir. As for what they did with these pills, whether they offered them to the wily guest elders to build goodwill, kept them for themselves, or rewarded them to direct disciples of the ancestral hall, Li Yuan would never ask. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon wasn't talking about 1 or 2 water elixirs from the Plenty River, but rather he was asking for an entire bottle of the most precious water elixir containing abundant incense offering and water fortune essence. In other words, at least 9 water elixirs. Li Yuan could have considered this 300 or 500 years ago. Now, however, his damaged godly body was not faring much better than that of Shenlin, which was already on the verge of shattering. Was the Southern Fragrance Water Palace shamelessly helping Paddling Island because Shun Lin was truly so generous? This lady was good at managing her region, and she was a most frugal person. Thus, it was only because she was regarding Spiritual Master Fire Dragon as a benevolent bodhisattva that she was under the impression that she was grabbing onto a wisp of hope. No? Shun Lin was simply taking a huge gamble, feeling like she could overcome this tribulation if Spiritual Master Fire Dragon put in a few good words for the Southern Fragrance Water Palace in front of that person. Li Yuan shook his head as he thought about this. People all said the Great Tao was heartless, but what this had referred to in the beginning wasn't immortals in the mountains, but instead those beings in the heavens. And that so-called Li Lu was one of the most powerful and influential beings in the heavens. To put things bluntly, Shun Lin's gamble this time would exhaust several dozen years of her lifespan. Had she forgotten what Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had said in the beginning? He had said that the Southern Fragrance Water Palace only needed to observe these matters from the sidelines. Zhang Shanfeng felt slightly puzzled. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and said, "It's difficult to force a cow to drink. Has Chun Ping'an broken through?" Zhang Shanfeng asked in a quiet voice. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon shook his head and replied, "He's still at the 3rd tier, but he's already reached the barrier to the next tier. To Chun Ping'an, the Willow Tendon tier can probably be viewed as a genuine cultivator trapping tier. This can't be helped. He's experienced the infancy of 3 difficult barriers very early on, that being mental demons integrating with Tao and pursuing truth. In addition, his bridge of immortality was also shattered, forcing him to stumble around as he walked forward. Otherwise, if he remained too composed and stable, I would have become suspicious of whether this young lad was actually the reincarnation of some mighty being from the mountain peak. Isn't it good to be the reincarnation of a deceased immortal?" Zhang Shanfeng asked. "I've heard that many old ancestors of sect-level forces will leave a path of retreat for themselves before entering life and death seclusion, allowing the disciples in the sect to find their reincarnation. By making these preparations in advance, they can more easily pick up their fated opportunities in the future." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon shook his head and commented, "It's not that good. The reincarnated person isn't the same as the deceased person after all. It will be slightly better if they're never able to remember the events of their past life, but it will be a huge problem if they're only able to remember bits and pieces of the past." Of course, Li Lu was an exception, being born with the full knowledge of her past life. To her, she was simply changing bodies again and again. Indeed, it could be said that she had never actually died. Falling unconscious each night was minor sleeping, while passing away for good was major sleeping. If a cultivator forcefully extracted profound secrets of the heavens for the sake of staying alive, acting like a furtive thief under the veil of night, then what would happen when they reincarnated with an incomplete soul that was rounded out by the fragmented souls of other people? At that time, who would the reincarnated person actually be? However, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon could understand the fear of death and the pursuit of life displayed by some upper 5-tier cultivators. Of course, understanding them was one matter, and the old spiritual master still didn't approve of their methods. Some unorthodox and demonic forces would light a stick of so-called life incense in the ancestral hall for their disciples, and there were many historical records of cultivators suffering a collapse of their Tao heart after staring at their stick of incense for a moment too long. They would comprehensively fall to demonic ways, and this was caused by a deep sense of self-inflicted fear. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon comforted his disciple in a rare sight, saying with a faint smile, "I said before that Chan Ping'an was walking with a crippled leg, and this was more a case of his mental hesitation affecting the direction of his heart. In reality, it's not a big deal for him to stay at a lower cultivation base for a while." Zhang Shanfeng still felt a little worried as he asked, "Chun Ping'an still owes so many debts, so how can he address these matters?" Chun Ping'an is most afraid of owing debts of gratitude and owing money. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and replied, "Chun Ping'an is actually not afraid of some of these bigger worries. For example, he isn't walking too quickly as he ascends the mountain with his head down, but when he discovers that he can bend down and pick up immortal coins a few steps ahead, even if it's only a single snowflake coin, do you think Chun Ping'an will walk a bit faster? Picking up an immortal coin is like getting rid of one worry. So as time goes on, he can naturally walk quicker and quicker." This completely lifted the weight from Zhang Shanfeng's mind. His master was truly quite impressive. He had only seen Qian Pingyan 2 times, yet he already possessed such a good understanding of him. The dust is settled. We can return to Paddling Island now, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon suddenly said. Li Yuan finally couldn't help but ask, "What cultivation base is Mr. Qian at?" Li Yuan couldn't hear a single word of the conversation between Spiritual Master Fire Dragon and his disciple. The old Spiritual Master was the #1 fire element cultivator in the world, and he could most likely rank inside the top 10 for water element cultivators as well. One had to remember that Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was also an external Heavenly Master of Mount Longhu. Just what kind of place was Mount Longhu's Heavenly Master residence? The cultivators in the mountains all viewed lightning techniques as the pinnacle of all immortal techniques in the world, treating it as the cardinal of heaven and earth that ruled over all other techniques. Meanwhile, the 5 lightning righteous technique, wielded by esteemed Taoist priests of the Heavenly Master residence, was the most orthodox lightning technique in the world. That being the case, would Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's mastery of lightning techniques not be impressive as well? Generally speaking, apart from not having Heavenly Master seals and immortal swords, external Heavenly Masters of Mount Longhu could study all the immortal techniques of the mountain. It was because of this that Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was able to remain so unique and transcendent in the northern complete reed continent, a place that was brimming with sword cultivators. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon ignored Li Yuan's question, leading Zhang Shanfeng down the clouds and into the residence on Paddling Island. Qian Pingyan had already walked out of his room for seclusion, with his aura hidden and his skin appearing lustrous. However, his acupoints were yet to fully stabilize because he had only just finished refining his bonded item, with spiritual energy rippling through his body and causing him to appear increasingly ethereal and otherworldly. He could freely control this elementary immortal aura once he stabilized his wood residence. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded and praised. "I didn't achieve such an aura when I was at the lower 5 tiers back then." Qian Pingyan cupped his fists in gratitude. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon didn't complain about Qian Pingyan's pedantic adherence to etiquette this time. When acting as someone's guard on the path of cultivation, it was necessary to stick to these surface-level etiquettes when the cultivator successfully exited seclusion. "Since you've succeeded, Shanfeng and I won't stick around for too long. There is still a pile of things needing my attention at Ground-Lying Peak," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said. "Sleeping anywhere is the same, no?" Zhang Shanfeng mumbled. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon wasn't the least bit annoyed at his disciple throwing him under the bus, and he instead chuckled and explained, "Napping at home is naturally a bit more comfortable." It wasn't without reason that cultivators took over the famous mountains and large rivers that were far away from the mortal world. Immortals had a tendency to move into the mountains, leaving the mortal world where there would be many mortal relationships and headaches. Entering famous mountains could allow immortals to enjoy both physical tranquility and mental tranquility. Zhang Shanfeng nodded and concurred. "I do miss my seniors and juniors a lot. I might have to trouble old Spiritual Master with another matter," Qian Pingyan said. However, Zhang Shanfeng had already chimed in and said, "There's no trouble at all." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and didn't say anything. Zhang Shanfeng was afraid that his master would think he was siding with an outsider, so he hurriedly added in a low voice, "Master, Qian Pingyan is very sensible when dealing with matters, so what he calls troubles probably won't be too much of a hassle. This is equivalent to us earning some goodwill for essentially no price. Qian Pingyan will definitely visit our home before he leaves the northern complete reed continent and returns to the eastern treasured vile continent, so I can take him around the mountains at that time. In fact, there are quite a lot of places at home that I still haven't really explored yet. For example, Peach Mountain and the area around Profound Dawn Peak." "This isn't right." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded before turning to Qian Pingyan and saying with a smile, "Go ahead." Qian Pingyan said that of the 122 green-colored glaze roof tiles he had, he only wanted to keep 2, and he hoped that the old Spiritual Master could help him sell the rest to the Middle-earth Divine Continent's White Emperor City. Moreover, he would only pocket 600 grain rain coins. Zhang Shanfeng was completely dumbstruck. He was just about to say something, but he was stopped by Qian Pingyan's gaze. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was seemingly weighing up the pros and cons, smiling and not saying anything as he contemplated Qian Pingyan's request. Chen Ping'an quietly waited for the old spiritual master's response. Distant water couldn't address immediate thirst. Downtrodden Mountain was in desperate need of immortal coins right now, with many holes waiting to be filled. Moreover, these holes were all very large in size. Raising the lotus root blessed land to a medium-grade blessed land was one of the most important matters, and discounting the income from Weibo's third night travel banquet, Chen Ping'an could plug all of the holes if he managed to sell the green-colored glaze roof tiles and immediately earn 600 grain rain coins. Not only that, but he would even have approximately 200 grain rain coins to spare. He could send more than half of this amount to Zhu Lian to act as Downtrodden Mountain's savings, lest they be found wanting when they needed to spend money again. Since there was no other option sometimes, he might as well take out a bigger debt of gratitude. However, he could only do so sparingly. This was better than taking out many small debts of gratitude that couldn't be repaid. If that were the case, then it wouldn't be asking friends for help anymore, and these friends would eventually feel like they had befriended the wrong person. When it came to asking favors from friends, it was always the case that favors should be returned, making it easier to exchange more favors in the future. In any case, was it appropriate to take advantage of Weibo, the mighty formal god of the northern mountain, all the time? Was it appropriate to have him dig for money in his own jurisdiction? Even rabbits didn't feed on the grass beside their burrows. In any case, Chen Ping'an could also be viewed as a wandering merchant, and even if he had traveled a long way with a caisson ceiling, was he not better than a rabbit? Chen Ping'an could keep 100 grain rain coins for himself, using these immortal coins to purchase 2 or 3 replica immortal swords from Hatred Sword Mountain. If the replica swords were truly cheap, far lower than his expected price, then he could purchase a few more to gift them to other people, no? Apart from this, building and running the mountain protection formation of Downtrodden Mountain would be another significant expense. The third matter was the choice and placement of subjugation treasures at Grey Vale Mountain, Aoback Ridge, and the various other newly acquired mountains. In reality, Zhang Shangzhen had made an excuse when gifting Downtrodden Mountain the 3 treasures back then, saying that he was thanking Chen Ping'an for helping the True Realm sect recruit a sword immortal guest elder, and making up for his failure to attend the 2-night travel banquets hosted by Weibo. Add to that the pair of Dragon King baskets that Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had taken away to repair, and Downtrodden Mountain already had 4 valuable subjugation treasures. As for the rest, Downtrodden Mountain would need to purchase these with its own money. Thus, Chen Ping'an only asked to keep 2 of the green-colored glaze roof tiles as a memento. These treasures were difficult to obtain, after all, so he could keep them at Downtrodden Mountain as a pair of auspicious treasures to symbolize good things coming in pairs. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and remarked, 600 grain rain coins? Is this half price? Chen Ping'an, you're making a huge loss with this transaction. This depends on the person, Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. If it were a certain other wealthy person, then I wouldn't so much as blink if I sold it to them for 2,000 grain rain coins. According to Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's earlier appraisal, the 120 green-colored glaze roof tiles could sell for 1,200 grain rain coins at White Emperor City's colored glaze pagoda. However, some transactions couldn't be calculated like this. Accidentally picking up such a large pile of green-colored glaze roof tiles was already a huge and unexpected surprise. Otherwise, based on Chen Ping'an's initial thinking and Spiritual Master Huan Yun's uncertainty about the price of these roof tiles, Chen Ping'an would have done exactly as Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had guessed and sold the roof tiles individually for a low price at the Northern Complete Reed continent. He would have been ecstatic to sell them for 1 lesser heat coin each, and he might have even sold the last 2 roof tiles instead of holding on to them as mementos. Why was Chen Ping'an giving Ground Lying Peak a discount of 50%? Firstly, this decision would allow Chen Ping'an to immediately receive an unimaginably large sum of grain rain coins. Secondly, he could express gratitude to Spiritual Master Fire Dragon for giving him guidance and offering him protection as he refined his bonded item. Thirdly, this could prevent many unexpected situations that could potentially arise from him personally dealing with the Middle-earth Divine Continent's White Emperor City. And lastly, Chen Ping'an still hoped to visit Ground Lying Peak and look for Zhang Shanfeng when he traveled south to go home, and completing this transaction would give him a bit more confidence in the sense that he wouldn't owe the old spiritual master a boatload of favors. He wouldn't need to feel shameless as he enjoyed free food and free drinks at Ground Lying Peak. There were some calculations involved, but there were also some considerations with no calculations at all. There were kind intentions and there were also selfish thoughts. Chen Ping'an was open and honest about all this. Make haste and refine the disarrayed spiritual energy in your 3 critical acupoints, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said. Otherwise, you'll end up returning it to Paddling Island and the Dragon Palace Small World, and wasting the goodwill shown by Xin Lin and Li Yuan. This will be equivalent to a host kindly offering you a cup of tea, yet you decide to leave after taking just 1 or 2 sips. Just what kind of attitude is this? This is the first matter. Secondly, human power has its limits, and it's inevitable that you won't be able to absorb all of the spiritual energy. You're only a 3rd-tier qi refiner after all, so you can't drink so much tea that you end up drowning yourself. The hosts might be treating their guests with sincere kindness, but they won't want to end up dealing with the corpse of their guest either. That would be far too inauspicious. Thus, you can earnestly study and practice the 2 refinement mantras pertaining to the refinement of mountains and refinement of waters, and you can continue to refine the Tao intent contained inside the gray bricks of the Taoist temple. This is also a form of cultivation. Before this, you were oblivious to the fact that you were standing amid a mountain of treasures. Moreover, are these high-grade Tao mantras that can refine all matters truly used for no other purpose than to refine physical items? You can mull over this by yourself. Thirdly, regarding the 120 green-colored glaze roof tiles and the 600 grain rain coins, this is a price that you've proposed. There aren't any buyers in the world who will offer more money for no good reason, and I'm truly as poor a Taoist priest as they come. I'm renowned for my lack of wealth in the northern complete reed continent. Fortunately, I can borrow some money from my disciples at Peach Mountain and Secret Profound Peak, and it won't be too difficult to pull together a few 100 grain rain coins. So, I'll take the green-colored glaze roof tiles with me first, and I'll deliver a message to Secret Profound Peak's Yuan Lingdian and tell him to bring you the grain rain coins. I surmise that he'll arrive before you leave the Water Dragon sect. After saying this, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and continued, Rest assured, I won't give you 1 less grain rain coin, nor will I give you 1 extra grain rain coin. Chen Ping'an once again cupped his fists in gratitude. Zhang Shanfeng felt slightly conflicted. His master and his seniors were actually so wealthy, and Chen Ping'an was inevitably going to make a loss of 600 grain rain coins. His heart would ache even if Chen Ping'an's didn't. However, his immortal force was going to earn 600 grain rain coins. So was this the meaning of one's wealth not flowing to outsiders? That being the case, anything he said at this moment would feel inappropriate, regardless of whether he expressed happiness or disappointment. Zhang Shanfeng felt a little stifled. Dealing with these matters was truly difficult. Chen Ping'an, what do you think about Zhang Shanfeng's fist technique? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon suddenly asked. Chen Ping'an faltered for a moment before replying honestly, It's a bit slow and yet to be refined. Zhang Shanfeng felt so awkward that he almost wanted to dig a hole to bury himself. Master, you're not trying to forcefully brag about your own disciple because you feel like Chen Ping'an's aptitude is too impressive, right? You're not trying to win back some face, are you? There was no need for this. Was Zhang Shanfeng not aware of his own abilities? He was a slow learner, and he realized that he was still far from strong enough after leaving the mountains to travel around and vanquish demons. Thus, Zhang Shanfeng decided that he would only leave the mountains again after his Tao power was strong enough in the future. In any case, senior brother Yuan from Secret Profound Peak possessed good aptitude, and the little Taoist priests at Ground Lying Peak were especially fond of speculating whether or not their senior uncle Yuan was a golden core tier immortal. Chen Ping'an, you weren't wrong to pick the path of martial arts first, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said. I didn't actually choose it myself, Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. I had no choice at the time, and I would have died if I hadn't practiced fist techniques to nurture my body. I would have also failed to embark on distant journeys and do anything else. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded and said, No matter what, only by treating yourself well can you genuinely afford to treat others well. You need to clearly understand this. Afterward, is there any need to question your own heart when you grace the world with good deeds and acts of kindness? My opinion is that this isn't very necessary. Chen Ping'an pondered for a brief moment before smiling and replying, I understand. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon recalled something, and he chuckled. Since you're so fond of overthinking things, Also liking to stroll around Paddling Island and being able to assess a fist technique is yet to be refined, why don't I tell you a short story? You can draw your own conclusions after you finish listening. A scholar was crossing a river with a boatman, with the former having read many books and poems and the latter not recognizing a single character. The scholar expounded many profound principles, causing the boatman to go bright red with shame and embarrassment. A huge wave capsized their boat, knocking the two people into the water. The scholar was drowning and on the verge of death, and only the boatman, who possessed but a single skill and had no other belongings, was contemplating whether or not he should rescue the scholar. I've remembered it. I'll make sure to mull over the deeper meaning of this story, Chen Ping'an said. There was a hint of a smile on Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's face as he asked slowly, "Does there necessarily need to be a deeper meaning? It's because of my cultivation base and status that you're paying extra attention to my nonsensical musings." Chen Ping'an was just about to say something. However, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon waved his hand and said, "I'm standing on the shore, so I need not listen to the answer of someone standing on the boat." In the end, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon flicked his sleeve and casually retrieved the green-colored glaze roof tiles, drawing them into his large sleeve. It was said that the sleeves of those atop the mountains were as vast as the heavens, allowing them to store mountains and rivers. Chen Ping'an felt slightly envious. If he mastered this immortal mystical ability, then he would truly be like a fish in water when he became a wandering merchant again. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon walked to the shore first. The talismanic boat was silently docked there, undulating with the movement of the water. Zhang Shanfeng and Chen Ping'an slowly walked next to each other. "I only have some shallow observations regarding your fist technique," Chen Ping'an said. "Apart from your usual cultivation, remember not to stop practicing this fist technique when you return to Ground-Lying Peak." Zhang Shanfeng smiled and asked, "Then can I be regarded as half a fist technique master of yours?" Chen Ping'an replied with a single word saying, "Scram." "Rest assured, I'll help you push Secret Profound Peak Senior Brother Yuan to be a bit quicker," Zhang Shanfeng promised in a quiet voice. "I'll tell him to visit the Dragon Palace Small World as soon as possible. Senior Brother Yuan has a good temper even though his Dao power is very lofty." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon chuckled as he walked in front of the two young friends. It was truly difficult to say whether his disciple, Yuan Lingdian, had a good temper or not. This brat had been the most mischievous and unruly of his disciples in the past, with his cultivation base advancing due to his frequent fights. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had forced him to cultivate in seclusion in a cave at Peach Mountain for 10 years, and after he exited seclusion, he was grounded for another 60 years. Only then did his self-cultivation and temperament improve. Chen Ping'an stood at the dock and watched the talismanic boat rise into the sea of clouds. He planned to visit the Southern Fragrance Water Palace and thank water goddess Shenlin. However, he needed to ask Li Yuan for the directions first. After waiting for a long time, Li Yuan finally saw that talismanic boat fuck off from the dock. He immediately appeared on Paddling Island. A Dragon Palace Small World without Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was adorable and likable, no matter how he looked at it. Upon hearing that Chen Ping'an wanted to visit the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, Li Yuan replied that this was an easy request, and he immediately channeled a water element mystical ability to travel through the water with Chen Ping'an. He wasn't so basic and despicable as to prevent Mr. Chen from exchanging goodwill with Shenlin. Shenlin had diligently managed the Plenty River summer residence for many years, while Li Yuan felt like he had only been a tiny bit lazy in his role. Moreover, they both had their own responsibilities, so they wouldn't actively cross the boundary into each other's territory. In reality, whether purposeful or not, Li Yuan's lack of interpersonal skills and purposeful distancing of the Water Dragon sect leader Sun Jia was the main driver allowing the Southern Fragrance Water Palace to strike a perfectly balanced private relationship with the Southern Sect's Xiao Jingji, with this relationship appearing especially valuable and causing Xiao Jingji to feel a sense of gratitude. Even though she was at the unpolished jade tier, she still paid respects as if she were a junior whenever she saw the nascent tier Shenlin. After they arrived at the Summer Palace, they faced no obstruction at all as they entered through the side gate. Being the water official of the Plenty River was a very beneficial role. In any case, those big sisters at the Southern Fragrance Water Palace all had a very good relationship with Li Yuan. They were all like a family, one big family. The Southern Fragrance Water Palace had very strict rules and regulations, so Li Yuan's slightly crude jokes actually enjoyed an even better reception here, with quite a number of subordinate deities and ghost maidservants with decent aptitude being most fond of listening to this young-looking water official talk about the romantic stories of the mortal world. The room would be filled with silvery laughter whenever Li Yuan covered those steamy scenes, and some of the more easily embarrassed women would shyly chide him after they finished listening with bright red faces, after which they would leave in a graceful manner. TSK, their swaying hips would truly sway one's mind. Walking through the familiar corridors of the water palace, Li Yuan couldn't help but sigh with emotion, thinking that he would truly be living a great life if his godly body were still unblemished. It wasn't long before Shen Lin walked out to personally welcome the two visitors. Li Yuan initially hadn't planned to stay with them, thinking that his job would be over after he led Chan Ping'an to Shen Lin. He had planned to look for those big sisters to have a heart-to-heart discussion, asking them whether they had taken a fancy to any of the water dragon sect's young and talented cultivators, and whether they needed his help to pull some strings and surreptitiously set up a chance encounter or some small misunderstanding. However, Mr. Chan said that he would return to Paddling Island after a short chat, so Li Yuan could only feel a deep sense of remorse as he temporarily pushed aside those steamy stories that he had recently heard and was planning to retell. In the past several hundred years, Li Yuan had retold and added extra embellishments to more than 100 stories pertaining to those in the mountains and those outside the mountains, yet it appeared like the romantic stories featuring that bastardly Jiang Shangzhen enjoyed the best reception, something that was completely outrageous. Chan Ping'an was holding a brick of specialty tea, a small gift without any lofty thoughts. In reality, it was nothing more than just a small gift. There was nothing he could do about this, and he genuinely wasn't able to find any suitable thank you gift. Even so, Shen Lin was still very happy, with her emotions not fake at all. Upon hearing that this was a specialty tea from the Rainbow Sparrow residence, she further asked Chan Ping'an and Li Yuan to stay, personally brewing tea in the pavilion beside the flower garden. She also asked for young Master Chen's understanding, seeing that she was using his gift to entertain her guests straight away. Shen Lin didn't reveal her true appearance this time, instead using a mystical ability to cover up her severely fractured face. Chan Ping'an couldn't help but sigh with slight emotion as he drank the tea. She was clearly a deity, yet she was so good at dealing with people. Shen Lin also had some thoughts at this moment. Looking at young Master Chen's temperament as he drank tea, this young cultivator who had enjoyed personal protection from spiritual master Fire Dragon was most likely an official immortal from a sect-level force or a noble descendant from a wealthy clan. Chan Ping'an asked about refinement techniques pertaining to water elixirs, inquiring about how he could be less wasteful. Shen Lin naturally wouldn't keep any secrets, and she clearly explained several key points, allowing Chan Ping'an to benefit greatly. This was the difference between having a good teacher and not having a good teacher on the path of cultivation. Perhaps vagrant cultivators could snatch many fated opportunities from official immortals, but how to digest these fated opportunities and treasures to obtain eventual success was another matter altogether. Whether one could digest 80% or 100% was dependent on whether their immortal force had orderly inheritances and lasting Tao teachings. As time went on, many seemingly small differences could ultimately result in a difference of an entire cultivation base. If this pertained to the Dragon Gate tier and the Golden Core tier, then the gulf between the two tiers would be like the gulf between heaven and earth. From the beginning to the end, Shen Lin didn't ask a single question about Chan Ping'an's identity or background. In fact, she didn't even prod him for any information. Chan Ping'an bade farewell and returned to Paddling Island after enjoying some tea. Li Yuan once again led the way for him. After arriving at his residence on Paddling Island, Chan Ping'an sat down on the cushion and started to plan out his cultivation. Meanwhile, Li Yuan returned to the pavilion at the Southern Fragrance Water Palace and met with Shen Lin, who had yet to put away the tea set. Li Yuan didn't actually like to drink tea, but since Shen Lin had already brewed some tea again, he didn't mind too much and started to leisurely drink the freshly brewed tea. This was ultimately better than drinking water, no? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's visit seemingly made Shen Lin feel a lot more relaxed. Li Yuan and Shen Lin casually discussed some recent matters pertaining to the mountains of the northern complete reed continent. For example, Jiyu and Guyu both perishing in battle, the great emblem sword sects Lu Jinglong starting to cultivate in seclusion, and the female sect leader of the refreshing sect surprisingly having a Tao partner. Li Yuan was slightly frustrated when he talked about sect leader He, saying that it would have been amazing if this beautiful and ethereal woman had never been touched by a filthy man in her lifetime. Xun Lin appeared slightly adrift as she looked at Li Yuan. She was quite envious of this water official's ability to laze around, entertaining himself in the human world even though he was a deity. Over at Paddling Island, Qian Ping'an felt like from now onward, he wouldn't have free time for a single moment. He had only completed the first step regarding the Tao intent contained inside the 36 gray bricks, having just barely managed to invite it into his mountain shrine to take root. Afterward, the most critical thing he needed to do was to comprehensively refine this Tao intent into his mountain root. Otherwise, the Tao intent would be nothing more than decoration. However, Tao intent was difficult to refine, requiring even more time than slowly moving those wisps of water fortune to his water palace. There was no shortcut to take, and he could only rely on slow and steady work to gradually refine the Tao intent. Qian Ping'an performed some rough calculations, concluding that complete refinement of the first gray brick would take an entire month, given that he spent at least 12 hours every day refining it. Perhaps refining the Tao intent of the remaining 35 gray bricks would become quicker and quicker, but even so, it would most probably take 2 to 3 years to slowly refine all of them. Carrying gray bricks up the mountains and moving water fortune into the residence were both long-term matters. Fortunately, Qian Ping'an understood that his practice of fist techniques was starting to become slightly stale and ineffective, so he could now turn more of his attention to cultivation as a qi refiner. In reality, Qian Ping'an no longer needed to strictly practice walking meditation a set number of times each day. Instead, with his cultivation base on the verge of a breakthrough, he simply needed to go with the flow and maintain the flow of fist intent around his body. As for whether he could advance to the Vajrabadi tier as the strongest 6th-tier martial artist, it wasn't that he wouldn't pursue this, but he simply wouldn't go out of his way to do so. He would accept it if he succeeded, and he wouldn't be too disappointed if he didn't. There was no need to go overboard with practicing fist techniques simply for the sake of obtaining some martial fortune to bequeath unto Pei Qian. After all, how could he teach his opening disciple if he ended up wandering down a stray path? Since when had Qian Ping'an forcefully pursued martial fortune? If even he wasn't forcefully pursuing it, then was it necessary for his disciple to take a shortcut on the path of martial Tao? There was no such rule in the world. Pei Qian didn't deserve these benefits simply because she was Qian Ping'an's disciple. Moreover, Qian Ping'an had a vague and indistinct feeling that it would be difficult for him to become the strongest 6th-tier martial artist following the dissipation of Senior Gu Yu's martial fortune. In reality, there wasn't a necessary relationship between the martial fortune pursued by Qian Ping'an and the martial fortune bequeathed by Senior Gu Yu, but the matters of the world were sometimes mysterious and inexplicable in these kinds of ways. In any case, there were prodigious martial artists in all 9 continents of the world, with each having their own experiences and fated opportunities. As such, would Qian Ping'an dare to claim that he was the purest martial artist? Qian Ping'an no longer spent too much effort observing the scenery of the final barrier of the 18 stops technique. There was also no hurry to temper the blades of 1st and 15th, and to eventually transform the 2 flying swords into his bonded items. Afterward, he would follow the old spiritual master's suggestion while he stayed at Paddling Island, taking his time to properly refine the abundant spiritual energy accumulated in his 3 critical acupoints. It was raining outside again. Qian Ping'an thought for a moment before standing up from his cushion and walking out with his oil paper umbrella. The mountains and waters were the same as before, and there were still questions in Qian Ping'an's mind for him to reflect on. However, Qian Ping'an felt like he possessed one good quality, that being, he was relatively good at enduring hardships as long as he wasn't bewildered and was able to take that first step. He slowly walked through the rain. Making sense of one fundamental matter would allow him to make sense of a myriad of other matters. He could push apart the clouds to see the clear sky and the bright moon. There were many blemishes and significant shortcomings in his heart, but he could simply work toward rectifying these issues. For example, there was the saying, "For a good deed that is intended, there is to be no reward." But so what if there was no reward? Would a good outcome bestowed upon another person not be good anymore simply because there was no reward for the person doing good? If he intentionally performed good deeds, yet he was truly unable to rectify and make up for those mistakes, Not able to accumulate virtue and merit for those wronged souls, then he would search for other methods to rectify the mistakes. He had traveled around the mountains and rivers for many years, finding solutions and forging paths in the face of all kinds of challenges. Chen Ping'an believed that noble people shouldn't seek rewards when doing good deeds. So could he become a sanctimonious hypocrite and feel dissatisfied when he wasn't rewarded for his good deeds? If this deeply hidden selfishness were allowed to manifest and grow, could he truly avoid deceiving and harming others in the future? At that time, the more so-called principles were placed in the basket on his back, the more he would be oblivious to his own obliviousness of proper principles. He untied the knot in his heart. His mind was able to relax, but the weight on his shoulders was hefty. However, Chen Ping'an didn't think much about this. He was still Chen Ping'an even if he wasn't wearing straw sandals anymore. Enduring hardships was the one thing that all of the impoverished families in the world didn't need to brag about. Only by being able to endure hardships could they enjoy good fortune in the future. Chen Ping'an walked a circle around the perimeter of Paddling Island before returning to his room in the residence. He sat down on the cushion and started to meditate, slowly refining the spiritual energy contained inside his wood residence. The spiritual energy of heaven and earth was the most valuable immortal currency for cultivators. He could treat this as another method of earning money. Regarding how to absorb the most spiritual energy while waiting for secret profound peaks Yuan Lingdian to visit Paddling Island, Chen Ping'an set aside 12 hours a day to refine qi. Apart from this, he naturally didn't forget to draw talismans as well. Chen Ping'an didn't cultivate so much that he forgot to eat and drink, and he only cultivated for exactly 12 hours each day. A skinny middle-aged Taoist priest visited Paddling Island one day, not arriving on a talismanic boat and instead descending through the sea of clouds. The Taoist priest smiled faintly as he looked at Chen Ping'an, who had walked outside to welcome his guest. The Taoist priest bowed and said, "I'm Secret Profound Peaks Yuan Lingdian, Zhang Shanfeng's fifth senior brother. Young Master Chen can refer to me as Yuan Jishuan." Chen Ping'an hurriedly cupped his fists in response. He naturally wouldn't refer to the middle-aged Taoist priest as Yuan Jishuan, and he instead referred to him as Senior Yuan. Chen Ping'an led the Taoist immortal, who didn't look old but was actually very senior and possessed very lofty Tao power, to his temporary residence. Zhang Shanfeng was unaware of the true power of the immortal force that he belonged to, whereas Chen Ping'an knew quite a bit more. Before traveling to the northern complete reed continent, Wei Bo had roughly recounted to him many interesting stories relating to Ground-Lying Peak. These weren't big secrets, and anyone who put in some work could gather this information as well. Of course, it was still very difficult for small and ordinary immortal forces to read news about Ground-Lying Peak and its Taoist priests in the immortal newspapers. Indeed, the disciples at Ground-Lying Peak and the disciples who were able to establish their own mountains weren't the type of cultivators who liked to deliberately show off and seek attention. This mighty Taoist priest from Secret Profound Peak didn't possess the highest cultivation base among spiritual Master Fire Dragon's disciples, but in the northern complete reed continent, he was publicly regarded as an unpolished Jade-tier Taoist immortal who could be treated as an immortal-tier Taoist immortal. After handing the 600 grain rain coins to Chen Ping'an, Yuan Lingdian extended an invitation to him to visit Ground-Lying Peak and Secret Profound Peak in the future. He didn't make any further small talk after this. It wasn't that this immortal from Secret Profound Peak was arrogant and haughty, looking down on the third-tier Chen Ping'an, but there was indeed nothing for the two of them to talk about. Thus, he came in a hurry and also left in a hurry. Chen Ping'an saw Yuan Lingdian off to the dock of Paddling Island. Yuan Lingdian smiled and said, "Young Master Chen, I need to thank you for looking after Shanfeng this entire time. You're too kind." "I didn't do much," Chen Ping'an replied. "I don't care whether I'm too kind or not." Yuan Lingdian smiled and retrieved a peachwood box from his sleeve, continuing, "There's a replica sword forged by Hatred Sword Mountain in this box. I'll be happy as long as young Master Chen isn't dissatisfied with this small gift." Chen Ping'an was slightly stunned. However, this didn't stop him from accepting the gift. Feigning politeness with these lofty immortals would be very stupid, no? Yuan Lingdian transformed into a streak of light and vanished into the distance. Chen Ping'an remained standing in the same spot with the peachwood box in his hand. He thought to himself that when he purchased replica swords from Hatred Sword Mountain in the future, he would have to purchase at least 2. even if they were slightly more expensive. Chen Ping'an had more than 100 usable grain rain coins in his possession right now, so his confidence was as high as it could be. Regarding Downtrodden Mountain's debt, that was a headache for Zhu Lian to deal with first. As for the remaining 500 grain rain coins, it wasn't that Chen Ping'an didn't trust Li Yuan with delivering them to Downtrodden Mountain, but he was truly unwilling to trouble the water official too much. There needed to be a limit on how much he commanded someone around. Thus, he would leave this matter for when he visited Lion Peak. It was approaching the end of winter. Chen Ping'an left Paddling Island. He had already written a letter addressed to Lion Peak and placed it on the table. At the same time, he placed Li Lu's 3 feet Sweet Rain, Hornless Dragon Jade tablet on top of the letter. Chen Ping'an had initially planned to ask the Southern Fragrance Water Palace's water goddess Shenlin to help deliver the letter and the jade tablet, but after some consideration, he eventually decided to ask water official Li Yuan to help him for the 3rd time. In any case, he had clearly explained some of these matters in the letter. As for the jade tablet engraved with the ancient seal script characters, Mountain's green rain like mist, he naturally needed to return this to Li Yuan. In the beginning, Li Yuan had refused to accept and look after the 3 feet Sweet Rain jade tablet, no matter what, coming up with a mountain of righteous excuses. It had taken Chen Ping'an a lot of effort to persuade Li Yuan, promising that he would help explain things to Miss Li if she reprimanded him for his actions. Only then did Li Yuan feel slightly more at ease. Since Li Lu was willing to refer to this young man as Mr. Chen, and since Mr. Chen was willing to vouch for him, there most likely wouldn't be any major issue with looking after the 3 feet Sweet Rain jade tablet. Before leaving, Chen Ping'an had also asked Li Yuan to help him bid farewell to the Southern Fragrance Water Palace. The water official had already gritted his teeth and mustered his courage to accept such a hugely difficult task, so something as simple as passing along a farewell was naturally no problem at all. Li Yuan insisted on seeing Chen Ping'an off to the other end of the bridge beyond the Dragon Palace Small World. Chen Ping'an continued his journey along the Plenty River, after returning the immortal Mandarin Wood tablet with the character, Rest. He was dressed in azure robes, carrying a bamboo bookcase, and holding a hiking pole. Sword Immortal and the Sword Nurturing Gourd were temporarily placed inside his bamboo bookcase. Li Yuan didn't leave the bridge, instead watching the young man disappear toward the west. He then returned to Paddling Island, not daring to even touch the Hornless Dragon Jade tablet as he carefully and quickly pulled the letter out from underneath, after which he hurriedly delivered it to Lion Peak as quickly as he could. 10 days later, Li Lu returned to the Dragon Palace Small World, properly looking at the extremely apprehensive water official Li Yuan with a smile in a very rare scene. She said that he had finally done something slightly meritorious. Li Yuan almost went weak at the knees and fell to the ground upon hearing this, and for the first time in his life, he felt like there were tears brimming in his eyes. Li Lu grabbed the Hornless Dragon Jade tablet and casually tossed it to Li Yuan, instructing the water official of the Plenty River to place it in the middle shrine. There it could help gather the essence of the incense offerings. Li Yuan prostrated himself and expressed gratitude in a quivering voice. However, Li Lu had already left for the Southern Fragrance Water Palace. Shenlin prostrated herself and broke down in sobs when she saw Li Lu. Li Lu made a grabbing motion, directly extracting the water goddess' godly body and placing her hand on its head. The tens of millions of fine fractures on the godly body immediately started to knit together and heal. Li Lu dropped her wrist slightly, causing the godly body to fall back inside Shenlin's physical body. She then sat down on a bench in the pavilion. Shenlin remained prostrated the entire time, not even daring to lift her head. "You've worked hard. If everything goes well, you can assume the position of the Plenty River Spirit Origin Lord in the future," Li Lu said. "This servant doesn't dare to have such fanciful dreams." Shenlin replied in a quivering voice. "This servant is already more than satisfied with serving as the water goddess of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace for the next 1,000 years. Li Lu furrowed her brows. Shenlin didn't dare to disobey her anymore, immediately kowtowing heavily and exclaiming, "As you command." Li Lu stood up and instantly vanished without a trace. Shenlin remained prostrated and unmoving for a very long time. Only when Li Yuan swaggered into the summer palace and arrived at the pavilion did she slowly stand up. It was as if she were living a different life. With the 3 feet sweet rain jade tablet hanging by his waist, Li Yuan's footsteps were light and nimble as he puffed his chest out and walked into the pavilion. He made a face at the seemingly dispirited water goddess and pointed at the jade tablet beside his waist. Take a look. What's this? Shun Lin paid no heed to Li Yuan's gesture, hesitating for a moment before sitting down on a bench with a dazed expression and murmuring, Li Yuan, I might become the spirit origin lord of the Plenty River in the future. Can you believe this? It was as if Li Yuan were struck in the head by spiritual master Fire Dragon's lightning technique, stunned into silence for a long time before grabbing his head and wailing in grief. He fell backward onto the ground and lay there, chaotically swinging his arms and legs around as he wailed, Why wasn't it me? We've already gone several thousand years without a spirit origin lord, so why wasn't I, the hard-working Li Yuan, appointed as the lord of the Plenty River? Even though Shun Lin had only revealed this secret due to her jumbled mental state right now, she didn't regret revealing this information to water official Li Yuan. After all, he would learn of this matter sooner or later. Rather than trying to conceal it and keep it a secret, causing Li Yuan to suffer an even bigger breakdown in the future, she was better off being forthright and telling him straight away. Otherwise, the knots in their hearts would grow even bigger. Li Yuan became stiff like a corpse. Shun Lin felt slightly exasperated. Li Yuan sniffed, with some semblance of life returning to his face as he said in a stifled voice, Lady Shun, congratulations on being promoted to the position of Spirit Origin Lord. Shun Lin smiled and said, You should cut down on teasing and fooling around with the female officials here when you wander around the Southern Fragrance Water Palace in the future. Li Yuan started to kick his legs around again, loudly yammering, No, I absolutely refuse. Li Yuan finally stopped his petulance, saying in a pitiful voice, I'm going to beg the old spiritual master to sell me a large pot of regret pills. I might as well stuff myself full until I die. The official recognition of the Plenty River isn't set in stone yet, Shun Lin said in a soft voice. Li Yuan turned his head, furiously rubbing it against the ground with a demented expression as he wailed in grief. Keep rubbing salt into my wounds, why don't you? Shun Lin became adrift at this moment, feeling thankful to spiritual master Fire Dragon, and also feeling thankful to that polite and courteous young man. Li Yuan suddenly jumped up, surprisingly shooting through the sky of the Dragon Palace small world and entering the Plenty River, giving chase to that unconscionable Mr. Chun. On the bank of the Plenty River, Chun Ping'an was cupping some water and washing his face. A head suddenly poked out from the water, so silent that Chun Ping'an almost threw a punch at it. Only after seeing it was Li Yuan did Chun Ping'an retract his fist intent that had instantly surged forth like a flood, asking with a smile, What brings you here? Li Yuan stepped ashore and asked with a smile, Are you tired, Mr. Chun? Do you need help carrying your bamboo bookcase? Do you need a massage? Chun Ping'an's skin crawled and he replied with a bitter smile, What in the world is the matter? Li Yuan squatted down and hugged Chun Ping'an's leg, wailing in desperation. Does Mr. Chun need any water elixirs? If so, then I have 2 bottles that are nothing more than burdens weighing me down. Did water officially still require any fucking face? No, he was going to trample on his face and become absolutely shameless today. Shun Lin could become a spirit origin lord, but according to the regulations of the Plenty River, there could still be the appointment of a Dragon Pavilion Lord. Even though the Dragon Pavilion Lord would be of a slightly inferior rank, they wouldn't actually fall under the jurisdiction of the Spirit Origin Lord. Rather, it was simply the case that the marine region managed by the Dragon Pavilion Lord would be slightly smaller than that managed by the Spirit Origin Lord. With one managing the east and one managing the west, the two wouldn't interfere with each other as they managed the Plenty River together. Chun Ping'an had no option but to squat down and say in exasperation, I'm going to leave if you keep acting like this. Li Yuan let go of his leg and sat down, asking in a quiet voice, Mr. Chun, do you actually know who she is? Chun Ping'an smiled and replied, What you know, I definitely don't know. I simply know that Miss Li is from my hometown, and is the older sister of a certain little troublemaker. In reality, Chun Ping'an was yet to guess Li Yuan's identity. As for the Southern Fragrance Water Palaces standing in the Dragon Palace small world, Chun Ping'an wasn't willing to delve into this matter. He was only able to vaguely guess that Lady Shen most likely had a unique standing among the many water gods of the Dragon Palace small world. After all, She was the water goddess of a water palace. Li Yuan didn't dare to reveal anything. He didn't want to go for wool and come back shorn, even losing the hornless dragon jade tablet that he had just obtained for the middle shrine. Li Yuan cut a dejected figure. Chen Ping'an could only sit down beside him, still carrying the bamboo bookcase on his back as he asked in a soft voice, "Is there anything I can help with? Why don't you tell me? I'll do my best to help as long as the requests are reasonable." It was Li Yuan's turn to be rendered speechless. Truth be told, he had only acted out of the ordinary and left the territory of the water dragon sect due to how dissatisfied and upset he felt. He wasn't genuinely fighting for the position of the Plenty Rivers Dragon Pavilion Lord. This was because Li Yuan was well aware of the fact that on the path of life, those whom he brushed past could be caught up to, but the matters that he let slip couldn't be chased again. Even so, Li Yuan wasn't willing to give up without a fight, feeling like he could still make one final attempt. Thus he blinked his eyes and tried his best to put on a sincere smile as he asked, "Mr. Chen, do you accept my gift of 2 bottles of water elixirs?" Chen Ping'an smiled and shook his head. "I knew it," Li Yuan lamented with a sullen expression. Chen Ping'an retrieved 2 pots of wine, a pot of midnight wine that he had purchased on the long stone arch bridge and a pot of rice wine. It was an old habit of Chen Ping'an's to purchase immortal wine wherever he went. Li Yuan accepted the pot of midnight wine and immediately started to gulp it down. Chen Ping'an hadn't drunk any wine during his time in the Dragon Palace small world, and only now did he take small sips of the rice wine from his hometown in silence. Li Yuan recalled a matter, something that he had started earlier, but had abandoned halfway. He had felt like it was too pretentious before, so he hadn't gone through with completing the task. This pertained to the Mandarin wood tablet with the character rest. He had asked the Water Dragon sect for one, but he had felt too embarrassed to give it to Chen Ping'an, lest the young man suspect that he had ulterior motives. After drinking Chen Ping'an's midnight wine, however, he tossed the Mandarin wood tablet to him with a chuckle and said, "Treat this as payment for the wine." Chen Ping'an caught the tablet and said with a smile, "Thanks." Li Yuan seemingly gave up on pursuing any benefits, having understood the current state of affairs. He stood up and said, "I'm off now. I'll go home to cry by myself." Chen Ping'an also stood up, cupping his fists and saying, "Mountains tall and rivers long, till we meet again in the future." Li Yuan faltered for a moment before nodding in response. He sniffed and remarked in a moping voice, "My heart at a loss as I return, countless green mountains and rivers thundering against the skies." 2. Chen Ping'an also faltered upon hearing this. Were they having a battle of poems? Perhaps Chen Ping'an was bad at composing poems, but he could easily recite the poems that he had read for an entire day and night with Li Yuan. "What are you staring at?" Li Yuan asked in an aggrieved voice. Chen Ping'an took a sip of wine. He was most likely overthinking things. Li Yuan leaped toward the Plenty River, but he didn't dive inside and travel underwater. Instead, he twisted and turned and traveled in circles above the water as he returned to his residence. From time to time, some big fish would be lightly kicked more than a dozen meters into the air before dazedly splashing back down into the river. Chen Ping'an retracted his gaze, finding this slightly amusing. He started to anticipate Chen Lingjun roaming the large rivers in the future. It was very likely that he would get along well with Li Yuan. Afterward, Chen Ping'an didn't experience any more hiccups as he traveled along the bank of the Plenty River. There were some minor encounters and experiences along the way. He had come across a large ship docked on the bank of the Plenty River one night, with a light lit in a room on the 2nd level. And thus Chen Ping'an had witnessed a noble woman removing her own head and placing it on the table, using an ivory hairbrush to gently comb her silky hair. As if detecting Chen Ping'an's gaze, she leaned over slightly and allowed her head to glance outside the window. She appeared embarrassed after seeing the young man in azure, and she put down her hairbrush and placed her head back on her neck. She didn't dare to catch the gaze of the young man standing on the opposite bank, and she curtsied in a graceful manner with her pearl hairpin tilted at a slight angle. Chen Ping'an smiled in response. Hearing the sobs of an infant, the noble woman immediately walked to the room next door in a brisk manner. Chen Ping'an continued on his journey. Not only did the large ship not have the gloomy aura of sinister ghosts, but it surprisingly had a wisp of scholarly fortune lingering around it. When traveling past a village located near the river, Qian Ping'an came across a mentally challenged young child from the village. He gently patted the young child's back. There always seemed to be one such pitiful person in the mortal villages of the world. Night arrived, and Qian Ping'an secretly visited the ancestral hall of the village to offer incense, after which he stood beside the skywell for a night, listening to some family gossip, and doing a few minor things. He only left after the sun rose again. He bade farewell to another winter and welcomed in another spring. Before he knew it, Qian Ping'an had already arrived at the end of the great river, where it flowed into the sea. He had camped in the wilderness during the previous New Year's Eve. There was a large city where the river flowed into the sea, and Qian Ping'an stood in front of a stall in the city, watching a customer ask the stallkeeper whether his mandarins were sweet. The stallkeeper chuckled and replied, "You'll only buy them if I say no, so the answer is no, they're not sweet." Qian Ping'an felt like a wandering merchant could only be regarded as established if they were this firm and unyielding. Thus he purchased 1/2 kilogram of mandarins from the stallkeeper, placing all but one inside his bamboo case. He then walked along the streets and alleys, planning to make his way to the Lightning God Manor's immortal ferry station at Infant Mountain after he left the city and witnessed the scenery of the great river entering the sea. There, he would take an immortal ship to Lion Peak. Holding the mandarin in his hand and slowly walking along the streets, Qian Ping'an suddenly stopped and turned around, looking toward a certain alley. Walking along the alley was a Taoist nun and a young man. Their ages were similar, but their statuses couldn't be further apart. One was a sect leader, while the other was the direct disciple of a sect's chief guest elder. The young man had felt slightly puzzled in the beginning. Not sure about why sect leader, he had suddenly adjusted their route, and decided to visit this city that was filled with immortal aura. Now he finally understood the reason. She was waiting for someone. An impoverished and despondent traveling scholar? Qian Ping'an didn't turn around and walk away. Instead he walked directly toward the small alley. He Xiaoyang's expression was calm and composed as she greeted with a smile. "Long time no see, Qian Ping'an." Qian Ping'an stopped at the entrance of the small alley, smiling faintly and saying, "The longer we don't see each other, the better." The young man standing behind his sect leader immediately narrowed his eyes, with a hint of killing intent flashing through them even though he didn't open his mouth to say anything. "You especially came here to look for me again?" Qian Ping'an asked. There was a complicated look in He Xiaoyang's eyes as she shook her head and replied, "Not specially. I was coincidentally passing by, so I decided to come here to meet you." The young man felt like his entire world was collapsing. How could he still feel any killing intent at this moment? His Tao heart was almost about to shatter into a million pieces. In his eyes there only seemed to be a single step between him and the godly sect leader He, but in reality the gulf between them was like the gulf between heaven and earth. He couldn't bring himself to develop any impure thoughts. Moreover, sect leader He was aloof to even Su Xian, and when had she ever been impressed by any man in the world? Looking at the young man in azure standing in front of her, He Xiaoyang felt slightly adrift in a rare and uncharacteristic display. In her impressions, it was as if Qian Ping'an should have always been a tanned young boy wearing a pair of straw sandals, with his eyes bright but limpid. He shouldn't be like the person standing before her. The young man and young woman had once come across each other in one of their hometowns. It was the same again this time, with the only difference being that they had come across each other in He Xiaoyang's hometown instead of Qian Ping'an's hometown. After all, the northern complete reed continent could be considered as half a hometown for the founding sect leader of the refreshing sect. For mortals outside the mountains, recognizing one's heritage and ancestors was of utmost importance. To cultivators in the mountains who were pure and free from desire, this matter was even more important. He Xiaoyang turned her head and said to the direct disciple of a guest elder standing behind her, "You can return to the sect first, Li Zhou." Li Zhou felt slightly dejected, but he immediately pushed aside his complicated thoughts and obediently heeded sect leader He's instructions. "Let's walk around?" He Xiaoyang suggested with a smile. Qian Ping'an nodded and replied, "It is time for a proper chat. Being hesitant and indecisive isn't right for a sect leader." He Xiaoyang turned around and entered a small alley, avoiding the middle and walking to one side, whether deliberately or not. Qian Ping'an walked on the other side of the small alley. Back at Malicious Ghost Valley, how did you guess that Gao Cheng and I were secretly plotting against you? He Xiaoyang asked. It was due to all kinds of subtle coincidences of fate, Chen Ping'an replied. And by conservatively overestimating sect leader He's Dao power and scheming abilities, I decided to make haste and run away. I didn't have any problem when cultivating at my sect, yet I faced the prospect of almost dropping down a tier. Say, how many sect leaders who have just advanced to the unpolished jade tier in the majestic world will face such misfortune? He Xiaoyang remarked. Chen Ping'an recalled what he had seen when purchasing mandarins back then, and he smiled and said, if apologizing can result in us minding our own businesses and keeping out of each other's ways, then I apologize to sect leader He Xiaoyang didn't offer a response to this, instead changing the direction of the conversation and commenting, you most likely wouldn't have been able to say this in the past. Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied, for the sake of living on, I could have even kowtowed and begged for mercy in the past. For example, you would have begged that mountain-moving ape not to severely wound Lu Xianying with a single punch if you were able to? He Xiaoyang asked. Of course, Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. If that old beast felt like my kowtowing wasn't sincere enough, then I would have strived to kowtow until my forehead split and bled like a blooming flower. And after kowtowing? He Xiaoyang asked. Chen Ping'an didn't conceal anything, replying, what else could I do? I would have continued to live my mundane life. Of course, it would be a different story if I were given the opportunity to settle the grudge in the future. Wine in the mountain only becomes more fragrant as it ages. What about now? He Xiaoyang asked. Chen Ping'an lightly tossed the mandarin in his hand up and down as he walked, replying slowly, my abilities are lacking, so I'll drink wine to cope. What else can I do? Blame heaven and earth and screech that the heavens are blind? Will the heavens acknowledge me if I do that? He Xiaoyang was just about to ask another question. If this were the case in the past, then what about now? Her master Lu Chun had once taken her along a complicated river of time, allowing her to see a multitude of different future Chanpans. However, the Chen Ping'an walking beside her didn't align with any of the multitude of Chanpan. There's no need to reminisce about the past. Chen Ping'an caught the mandarin looking at He Xiaoyang and asking with a smile, give me a firm answer, sect leader He. Can we each walk our own path without interfering with each other in the future? He Xiaoyang pointed at the sky and replied with a faint smile. Why don't you ask my master? As his direct disciple, I naturally don't dare to disobey my master's instructions. Chen Ping'an smiled and mused. Then I need to become even more powerful. I wonder how much wine I'll need to drink to cope in the meantime. This conversation was becoming very difficult due to He Xiaoyang's lack of sincerity. Meanwhile, He Xiaoyang didn't care about Chen Ping'an's thoughts at all, and she simply cared about whether or not his actions in the future would cause immense trouble for her pursuit of the Great Tao. Casting her mind back to the past, the gulf between their statuses had been immense when she had seen that young boy wearing straw sandals and carrying a large basket of snake gall pebbles on his back. Not only that, but the young boy's spirit and confidence had been in the mud when he had gazed up at the group of immortals standing on the stone cliff. Unexpectedly, however, his spirit and confidence had grown considerably over the past few years, while the gulf between their cultivation bases still remained as large as before. Chen Ping'an, do you understand that with your personality, each time you advance slightly and display increasing caution and stability, your adversaries will only develop a stronger will to kill you when given the chance? He Xiaoyang said in a soft voice. And? Is that also my fault? Chen Ping'an chuckled and continued. If sect leader He thinks so, then I need to voice my honest thoughts. Do you think my adversaries will refrain from extending a finger to casually squish me to death as long as I don't advance? I'd say quite a lot of people are itching to do so. However, they either think the price of doing so is too high or their cultivation progress is abysmal, preventing them from doing so. Upon thinking of this, my good mood had become even greater after encountering sect leader He in this foreign land. You feel like the others have done wrong first, but have you considered the possibility that you haven't done anything wrong, but you are the mistake to begin with? He Xiaoyang asked in a seemingly casual manner. Chen Ping'an remained calm and composed as he replied, there's no need to trouble sect leader He with posing these mortal and basic questions. Over the many years, it wasn't just the children around Clay Vase Alley who were the same age as me saying this for fun, But there were also some bastards who purposely repeated this to repulse me. Many elderly neighbors and kind-hearted people were also occasionally posing the same question with their eyes when they looked at me. He Xiaoyang fell silent for a long time. At the end of the small alley, He Xiaoyang stopped and said, "You already learned the truth a long time ago." Sect leader He, "I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about," Qian Ping'an responded. "It's enough as long as your heart understands," He Xiaoyang said with a smile. "Enough," Qian Ping'an retorted. "It's indeed not quite enough," He Xiaoyang concurred with a faint smile. As if mysteriously coming to terms with a certain knot in her heart, He Xiaoyang turned around to face Qian Ping'an as she continued, "I'll wait for you at the pinnacle of the majestic world's mountains. Otherwise, you and I can each walk our own paths without interfering with each other." This encounter at the end of the Plenty River was both a coincidence and a certainty. He Xiaoyang could often achieve what she wanted with a single thought. People could only shut up and deal with it if they were dissatisfied with her incredible fortune. After receiving an answer that surpassed his expectations, Qian Ping'an smiled and said, "Then I won't be seeing sect leader He off." "I didn't say I would leave straight away," He Xiaoyang chuckled. "As a sect leader who needs to worry about everything, it's very rare for me to take a trip outside. That being the case, shouldn't I cherish this opportunity of coming across someone whom I can't get off my mind?" Qian Ping'an uttered two names in response. Su Xian Li Zhou. He Xiaoyang smiled beautifully and explained, "One is able to control his actions and one is able to control his mouth. They won't disturb you." Qian Ping'an remained silent. "What's this? Is this still my fault?" He Xiaoyang asked in mock astonishment. Qian Ping'an almost felt the urge to kill her with a single punch. "If you're not capable enough, then just drink wine to cope," He Xiaoyang suggested in an understanding manner. "Do you have any good wine? I have some of the best immortal wine from the northern complete reed continent. I can give all of this wine to you." Qian Ping'an smiled with squinted eyes and replied, "It would be a shame to kill sect leader He with a single punch. Please don't get angry at my nonsensical drivel. Sect leader He would throw 2 punches even if he could kill her with a single punch." He Xiaoyang also smiled with squinted eyes, gently covering her mouth with a hand as she shook her head and replied, "I won't get angry. This is a long-awaited display of honesty and sincerity between us. This is a good thing." Qian Ping'an walked out of the small alley along with He Xiaoyang, who had reactivated her concealment technique. There was a noticeable gap between them, so it couldn't be said that they were walking side by side. Qian Ping'an looked straight ahead, gazing at the bustling street as he asked, "When are you leaving?" "Probably later than you're thinking," He Xiaoyang replied. "Have you always been this kind of person, He Xiaoyang?" Qian Ping'an asked. "Aren't you the same?" He Xiaoyang replied with a smile. "It's just that I understood myself from the beginning, while you've only understood yourself later. In this sense, things have been more difficult for you." The two of them exited the city and walked toward the western seashore along the bank of the Plenty River. Qian Ping'an stepped onto a tall platform on the seashore and suddenly said, "He Xiaoyang, the Tao that you're painstakingly pursuing is analogous to Ning Yao's position in my heart. Does this comparison make sense to you?" He Xiaoyang nodded and replied, "Of course. This isn't difficult to understand. The problem is, I don't want to accept this outcome." Qian Ping'an looked toward the distance and didn't say anything else. He Xiaoyang hesitated for a moment before squatting down beside him and asking, "The academy was along your route before, so why didn't you head over to visit?" In reality, she had only just left the academy not long ago. Qian Ping'an pursed his lips, lightly clenching his hands into fists and placing them on his knees. His sleeves naturally hung low as he replied, "Would you visit the White Jade capital and the main Taoist temples of the 3 other branches if Lu Chan were killed because of you?" He Xiaoyang fell silent for a long time before slowly replying, "Qian Ping'an, only today have I come to feel like becoming Tao partners with you isn't a barrier for me. Rather, this is already the best marital fate in the world." Qian Ping'an put down his bamboo bookcase and retrieved his sword-nurturing gourd, sitting down cross-legged and slowly drinking wine as he remarked out of nowhere, "The great Tao shouldn't be so small." He Xiaoyang changed her mind for some reason, standing up and deciding to leave this place earlier than initially planned. Before leaving, she turned to Qian Ping'an, who was leaning against his bamboo bookcase, and said, Romance between men and women is ultimately a minor matter. Regarding this, even the Tao ancestors' words don't count, to say nothing of your master Lu Chan, Chen Ping'an replied in a calm voice. He Xiaoyang chuckled in speechlessness before flying away on the wind. At the end of winter last year, Yuan Lingdian flew north after leaving the Dragon Palace small world, after which he suddenly swooped down and made his way toward the peak of an unfrequented green mountain. This wasn't an immortal mountain, and it was simply a tranquil mountain with an ordinary amount of spiritual energy. Upon arriving, Yuan Lingdian saw his master playing Go with a young woman. They had casually refined the mountain roots to use as black stones, and the water fortune to use as white stones. Yuan Lingdian bowed in respect to both of them before standing beside spiritual master Fire Dragon, not taking so much as a single glance at the Go board lest his Tao heart become unstable. There wasn't any genuine master of instruments, Go, calligraphy or paintings outside the mountains, as they were all languishing in terms of technique. Even when it came to the 100 schools of thought, there was still a distinction between high-level, medium-level, and low-level. Of instruments, Go, calligraphy and painting, those who played and studied instruments were slightly better off due to the conclusions of the sages, allowing instruments to have vague links with morality and virtue. Meanwhile, calligraphers were held in the lowest regard, with those who played Go looking down on those who painted, and those who painted looking down on those who were calligraphers. As such, calligraphers could only refer to the immensely virtuous act of the sages creating characters to vigorously argue with the others, becoming beet red in the face as they did so. This was the situation in the past, and it was still the case in the present. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon grabbed a Go stone and lightly placed it on the board with crisscrossing lines of Tao intent, asking, "You only gifted him a replica sword from Hatred Sword Mountain? I didn't do anything extra." Yuan Lingdian replied with a nod. Yuan Lingdian understood his master's intentions, given that he had also been a pure martial artist in the past. In fact, he had even advanced to the far-roaming tier as the strongest Vajrabadi tier martial artist. However, he had abandoned the martial fortune bequeathment after receiving guidance from his master, essentially accumulating martial fortune for the northern complete reed continent. In the end, he had shown great resolve to abandon martial arts and focus on pursuing Tao instead. The challenges and obstacles of doing so were even greater than those of ordinary nascent tier cultivators advancing to the upper 5 tiers. Yuan Lingdian understood that his master wanted him to provide Chen Ping'an with some guidance regarding fist techniques, but he didn't have much interest in doing so. In any case, he didn't feel like his involvement and guidance would necessarily be beneficial. At Ground-Lying Peak, unless Spiritual Master Fire Dragon explicitly stated what his disciples needed to think and do, the many disciples were free to think and act as they pleased without any issues. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon didn't say anything about Yang Lingdian's decision. Even though he had already lost the game of Go, he unexpectedly chuckled and remarked, "Seeking life from near certain death is indeed slightly difficult. The Go board is so small, so having such intentions is essentially the same as earnestly pursuing death," Li Lu said. Li Lu casually shattered the mountain roots and water fortune, allowing them to return to heaven and earth. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon also retracted the Go board manifested from Tao intent. Only at this moment did Spiritual Master Fire Dragon ask, "What was written in the letter you intercepted while it was en route to Lion Peak?" Li Lu sidestepped the question, replying, "Sure enough, it was water official Li Yuan who delivered the letter just as Spiritual Master guessed. It wasn't the Southern Fragrance Water Palace that helped with this task. He also chose to write an accompanying letter instead of directly sending the Jade Tablet to Lion Peak. Which is why you have a long and arduous journey in front of you by choosing this path," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said with a smile. "It's not the case that you'll necessarily know the most and be the most correct simply because you've lived many lives, while others have only lived a single life. Very well, I've lost the game of Go, but I've had a win beyond the Go board." Li Lu didn't mind these victories and losses on the Go board, nor did she mind those outside the Go board. She had experienced far too many things after all, so much so that she didn't even pay much attention to her current lifetime. She was treating this more as a journey through the undulating mountains and winding rivers. Since Li Lu was born with the knowledge of her past lives, it was only natural that she knew more than most people. This knowledge pertained not only to worldly matters but also to the human heart. Most of the deity statues enshrined in the Taoist temples and Buddhist temples in the world were gilded with gold. Thus, Old Man Yang had asked them, prisoners and sinister remnants, to take the opposite approach and wrap themselves with a human heart first. Even if it were only perfunctory, they should still embark on a proper journey around the genuine human world. Now, however, there were also matters that Li Lu genuinely cared about. For example, the battle between the great Tao that had caused earth-shattering turmoil back then was rearing its head again. Li Lu would occasionally think about finishing this battle before it could proceed any further, handing the current reincarnation of those people a comprehensive loss. Disregarding Qian Pinyin, spiritual master Fire Dragon still had some intentions behind placing stones on the go board of the Water Dragon sect. There was Shun Lin's promotion, the benefits for sect leader Sun Jia of the Water Dragon sect, and his remarks to water official Li Yuan. In reality, it wasn't false that spiritual master Fire Dragon had gone with the flow and helped the three individuals overcome their barriers, but his bigger hope was that some of Li Yuan's actions after he gained sense and reason would include repeating some remarks to Li Lu. After all, when it came to conducting oneself, Li Lu was ultimately still a junior even though she had already lived for thousands upon thousands of years. However, it was a pity that Li Yuan was unwilling to heed his guidance, while spiritual master Fire Dragon was unwilling to get overly involved. Yuan Lingdian sighed with emotion. While at the Middle-earth Divine Continent, his master had actually detected the unusual fluctuations of martial fortune at the ancient battlefield ruins of the Golden Armor continent already. If Chen Pingyan were able to obtain that martial fortune and win that game of Go, then he and that young woman from the Middle-earth Divine Continent, who was a similar age to him, would become a very interesting pair of opponents. However, things became increasingly complicated due to the appearance of Chao Ci, who hadn't intended to interfere. If Chao Ci hadn't gone to the ancient battlefield ruins, then the young woman Shi Zaishi, who had advanced to the 6th tier of martial arts as the strongest 5th tier, might have already broken through. However, she wouldn't have done so as the strongest in the tier because there was still Qian Pinyin, who was currently at the northern complete reed continent and possessed an even stronger and more stable cultivation base, along with more powerful fist intent. Yet, Chao Ci's appearance caused Shi Zaishi to be filled with fighting spirit, which was driven by her competitive nature. Being as prodigiously talented as she was, she managed to forcefully raise her cultivation barrier by another level, hell-bent on striking the 7th tier Chao Ci with her 6th tier fist. She was only willing to advance after striking Chao Ci with her fist, even if it were only a light brush. On the other hand, Qian Pingyan's martial arts barrier was higher than Shi Zaishi's to begin with, so he naturally needed to go against his nature and advance slowly. One was delaying things and one was taking things slowly. This created a situation where they were unknowingly playing a game of Go with each other. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon only knew that Shi Zaishi was at the battlefield ruins littered with collapsed deity statues in the Golden Armor continent, and he had only heard that Chao Ci had made his way to the same ruins as well. Relying on this information, he had performed some calculations to predict the current situation. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and said, "If Shi Zaishi is able to stop thinking about becoming the strongest, then that will be a very impressive feat. This might be a bad sign of losing spirit for other pure martial artists, but for Shi Zaishi, this will be a case of seeking life from the verge of death and attaining great freedom for her fist intent. This is presumably what Chao Ci wants to see, hence his decision to remain at the ancient battlefield ruins and voluntarily spar with Shi Zaishi. Even though Chao Ci is only at the Vajrabadi tier, he's coincidentally the best whetstone in the world for the proud and haughty Shi Zaishi. Indeed, the effectiveness definitely wouldn't be as apparent if she were facing a martial artist at the mountain summit tier." Yuan Lingdian nodded and concurred. Shi Zaishi's true barrier is with her heart, not with her fists. He then smiled and continued, "In fact, if Qian Pingyan's fortune is good enough and he continues to advance slowly, allowing him to remain as the current strongest 6th tier and not break through before Shi Zaishi, then he can still obtain a share of martial fortune bequeathment." "I say that's quite doubtful," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon commented. He then turned around and looked at his disciple saying, "I instructed you to deliver the money to Paddling Island because I hoped you would personally reveal this truth to Qian Pingyan. Martial artists speaking with fellow martial artists is more meaningful than an old spiritual master talking about the grand principles of fist techniques with a 3rd-tier cultivator." I wanted to see whether Chun Ping'an would hold on to a sliver of a hope, showing some subtle signs of slowing down even further for the sake of that martial fortune bequeathment. Or would he also use another method to seek life from the verge of death like Shirzaishi? Chun Ping'an has reached a dead end in terms of training fist techniques, and this isn't due to him slacking off. His life and death battles with other people have also not been incorrect. He can already console himself with the notion that human power has its limits, so can he naively launch punches to shatter the alley wall after reaching the dead end? Can he forge a path for himself? Yuan Lingdian smiled wryly, feeling a little guilty as he said, "It was this disciple's fault for ruining Master's plans. Should I return to the Dragon Palace small world now?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and replied, "Let it be. We should go with the flow for all matters. Do you think it will necessarily be a good matter for you to reveal this truth? Will Chun Ping'an necessarily succeed in becoming the strongest? When it comes to the path of mental cultivation, do you think there won't be side effects from going all out each time? If a person refuses to accept fate each and every time on the path of cultivation, thinking that seeking the absolute pinnacle is the better choice, the outcome will be death. After fighting to become the strongest 6th tier, one will fight to become the strongest 7th tier. And after becoming the strongest 7th tier, one will think that it's only right to obtain the title of strongest 8th tier. Achieving this, who would dare to fight them for the title of strongest 9th tier? Does such a person not deserve to die? Is this not a battle between the great Tao? If a person follows this path, they'll simply be gritting their teeth and displaying the anger of a common person. Since when has the martial Tao been so lowly? These principles are too extreme, Li Lu said with a shake of her head. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon also shook his head, responding, "Those who are pure need to quash these extreme principles as soon as possible." Yuan Lingdian didn't feel the least bit puzzled about these principles. Chao Ci did very well in this regard. He would ascend to great heights on the path of martial arts, but he wouldn't prevent others from doing the same. He would even render help to others when given the opportunity, just like how he was helping Shirzaishi temper her cultivation base. This was one of the reasons why Chao Ci was able to become peerless in the Middle-earth Divine Continent. This wasn't simply because his master was martial god Pei Bei, preventing him from being accidentally killed by upper 5-tier cultivators. Otherwise, there were far more than 1 or 2 upper 5-tier enemies from that destroyed empire, and even though killing Pei Bei would be an impossible dream, it wouldn't be too difficult to kill her disciple, the traveling Chao Ci, who was on a different continent. At the very least, they would still enjoy some chance of success. Chao Ci's thoughts and actions were his strongest Tao guardian. For example, he had traveled to the Golden Armor continent with his friend, Lu Yuzhou, this time, and on the surface it looked like the decision of the pure white continent's god of wealth regarding how much he was willing to value Chao Ci's life, and whether it was equally as valuable as that of Lu Yuzhou. In reality, however, this wasn't a result of the pure white continent's god of wealth weighing up the pros and cons, and it was instead Chao Ci's own decision. The genuine pure martial artists of the Middle-earth Divine Continent were more or less willing to display voluntary goodwill toward Chao Ci. They might even put in some good words for this junior during their casual conversations, and it was possible that they would perhaps step forward to personally quash some budding dangers. It was an ability to transform bad into good, and it was an even greater skill to transform good into better. What was truly observing the myriad of matters in the world wasn't one's eyes, but rather one's heart. Some people only saw Chao Ci's unparalleled aptitude and his master Pei Bei when they observed him. This was a case of their eyes being very observant, but their hearts being closed. Li Lu was most likely accustomed to Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's hostile remarks, so she smiled and replied, "These principles are only suitable for a small number of people." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon laughed heartily and said, "We'll objectively focus on the matters at hand, just as we'll objectively focus on the people of concern. We can't disregard all matters because of a single person, nor can we disregard an entire person because of a single matter. In this way, the notions of right and wrong won't be so convoluted and difficult to untangle." "That's difficult," Li Lu said. "Master is correct," Yuan Lingdian said with a nod. Would he help an outsider instead of helping his own master? In any case, Yuan Lingdian truly felt like his master was more correct. However, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon unexpectedly smiled and asked, "Then let me ask you this. What do you think about the examination of the heart for Chao Ci, and the strongest young cultivator of the northern complete reed continent? Where and when will they take place? Yuan Lingdian was a cultivator who was accustomed to speaking using power, and he was actually still yet to reach a state of perfection even after cultivating his mind for so many years. Thus, he had been stuck at the barrier of the unpolished jade tier for all these years. This wasn't to say that Yuan Lingdian was an arrogant and haughty person. He also wielded the Dao power and spoke the reasons of ground-lying peak, and when they left the mountains to train in the outside world, secret profound peaks, Yuan Lingdian actually enjoyed the best reputation out of everyone from their immortal force. However, he was surprisingly the person who was punished the most and punished the most severely by spiritual master Fire Dragon. Yuan Lingdian thought for a moment before smiling and replying, "It will naturally take place when the unparalleled Chao Ci encounters the latter and stands beside them or not far behind them. Not only that, but the latter will even have the opportunity to overtake Chao Ci. That will be the critical moment when Chao Ci's true self is displayed. As for Lin Su, who achieves certain victory whenever he decides to fight an opponent, he'll only face excruciating hardship when he loses comprehensively." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded in response, seemingly approving of these two answers. He then asked, "Then what about you, Lingdian? Why are you unable to advance? Are there any Taoist cultivators in the world who are like you, possessing immortal tier abilities but only being at the unpolished jade tier? I've opened my eyes wide and looked around, but I haven't been able to find many more. This is naturally because my cultivation of strength is more than sufficient, but my cultivation of the heart is still lacking," Yuan Lingdian replied. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and said, "Is your understanding of the profound Dao power true intent the most shallow compared to your seniors at Profound Dawn Mountain, White Cloud Mountain, and the other mountains simply because you started cultivating earlier, possess too much strength, contemplate too few matters, and advance too quickly? Or is it because I've punished you too severely, and you believe you simply haven't thought of the reason, even when you feel like you weren't wrong? And thus, you've been contemplating behind closed doors the entire time, trying to reflect on how you were wrong? And you'll be able to break through when you make heads or tails of these matters." "That's indeed the case," Yuan Lingdian admitted with a nod. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked, "Have you considered the possibility that you're contemplating your mistakes with the mindset that you were correct? And you're going in circles on this stray path?" He sighed and remarked, "Naive child. When masters teach their disciples, are they only allowed to point out the paths and the shortcuts? Are they not allowed to place barriers and challenges on the path, guiding their disciples in the right direction but making the journey difficult, thereby strengthening the Tao heart of their disciples?" Yuan Lingdian felt slightly aggrieved in an uncharacteristic display, and he replied, "Master's Tao power is profound, and his knowledge is vast, so this disciple isn't willing to question Master at all." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon pointed at his disciple from Secret Profound Peak and scolded in anger, "Go and ask that young man at Paddling Island if he has these thoughts given his young age. Even when it comes to Qi Jingchun, the Mr. Qi whom he respected the most, it wasn't necessarily the case that he was right all the time, was it? Ask him, does he dare to think this? Does he dare to earnestly mull over the sagely principles beyond the scholarly lineage, yet remain unafraid of these principles suppressing his earlier convictions and beliefs? Lingdian, if you feel like masters embody all of the principles and reasons in the world, yet disciples are only able to learn 70 to 80% of them, then what happens when these principles and reasons are passed down by disciples to their disciples and so on? How many principles and reasons will be left in the world? You don't even dare to think about these matters, Lingdian. So has your earnest cultivation for the past 600 years only advanced your strength without advancing your Tao heart? What's this? Does ground-lying peak need someone to move mountains and split firewood? Is that why there exists someone as physically strong as you?" Yuan Lingdian glanced at his master's slightly billowing sleeves and said carefully, "Don't get angry, master. We can discuss these matters calmly." Li Lu fanned the flames and interjected, "Yuan Jishuan only said he isn't willing, not that he doesn't dare. Spiritual Master, don't wrongly accuse Yuan Jishuan because you're too focused on speaking your own principles." Yuan Lingdian was almost angered to death by Li Lu's help. Just what kind of temper did his master have? Yuan Lingdian was most familiar with this, especially since he was the disciple who had suffered the most scoldings and beatings. If he claimed to be second at ground-lying peak, then no one would dare to claim they were first. Being unwilling is even worse than not daring. Not daring implies that consideration has at least been made, just that the step hasn't been taken yet. Sure enough, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon flared up in rage, eventually commanding in a cold voice. Go to the stone cave at Peach Mountain to enter seclusion for 10 years. Don't leave until you understand these matters. Yuan Lingdian fell silent for a moment before sighing in grief in his mind. 10 years wasn't much, and it would pass quickly with a short nap. However, this was very embarrassing. Following Master's distant journey, it was only he who needed to roll up his blankets and leave secret profound peak to enter seclusion in the stone cave at Peach Mountain. This being the case, would his two senior brothers from White Cloud Peak and Peach Mountain not frequently sit outside the stone cave to leisurely drink tea? And perhaps they would even ask him whether he was thirsty or not. A brilliant thought suddenly occurred to Yuan Lingdian, and he said in a quiet voice, Master, I promised Feng that we would find some time to leave the mountains together, so that I could help him fulfill a wish. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon didn't try to maintain his stern expression any longer, smiling faintly and replying with a kindly expression, even though it's your own mistake, you're not fixated on achieving victory against yourself. You won't show any carelessness when it comes to helping your seniors and juniors, and even though you concede that the small world of the human body is inferior to the outside heaven and earth on the surface, it's actually the case that the human heart rivals the heavenly heart. This embodies the limpid heart expected of cultivators. Very well. Since this is the case, there's no need for you to enter seclusion at Peach Mountain Stone Cave Lingdian. You can accompany Feng and diligently act as his Tao guardian for a while. Remember, don't reveal your identity or status. The two of you should only travel around the foot of the mountain. Rest assured, Master, Yuan Lingdian said with a bow. It was now his seniors at White Cloud Peak and Peach Mountain who should feel envious of him. Afraid that his master would go back on his word and retract his instructions, Yuan Lingdian immediately transformed into a streak of light and vanished into the distance. Yuan Jishuan has already thought things through, Li Lu said. He'll most likely enter seclusion and achieve a breakthrough when he returns from this trip. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded and concurred. So it doesn't matter at all that he's not going to Peach Mountain Stone Cave to repent in seclusion. The old spiritual master was using the principles and reasons that Yuan Lingdian was most open to accepting to slowly guide him and impart Tao upon him, helping to resolve his confusions. Otherwise, it wouldn't be wrong for Spiritual Master Fire Dragon to guide Yuan Lingdian like an ordinary master guiding their disciple, and an Ascension Tier Cultivator guiding an unpolished Jade Tier Cultivator, but the effectiveness of this wouldn't be great. Moreover, there would also be many hidden dangers. Principles and reasons weren't as simple as a few words or sentences. Rather, the listener needed to truly open their minds after listening, thinking beyond just the measly few words or sentences of the speaker, and ultimately obtaining an answer that had affinity with their great Tao. Yuan Jishuan possesses incredibly high comprehension ability, and if it weren't for you suppressing his nature, he could have potentially advanced to the Ascension tier even earlier, Li Lu said with a smile. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon sighed with emotion and explained, There's no way around this. This young lad is naturally lively and adventurous, so it's necessary to keep him in check. Otherwise, Ground-Lying Peak will naturally face trouble with its lofty standing. This is a small matter, and what's more undesirable is Yuan Lingdian advancing too quickly. Not only will his own cultivation base be lacking, but his seniors and juniors will inevitably have their Tao hearts detrimentally affected as well. This is a major matter. One spiritual master fire dragon is already like a huge mountain weighing on their hearts, so with the addition of Yuan Lingdian, it's only natural that they'll feel even more stifled. In addition, there's no need for Ground-Lying Peak to be hasty and push Yuan Lingdian to advance simply for the sake of gaining an extra Ascension tier cultivator. What belongs to him won't run away. Otherwise, if I'm no longer at Ground-Lying Peak one day, Yuan Lingdian's personality will definitely see him take on all responsibility by himself. However, his cultivation of the heart is lacking, so the principles and reasons of his seniors and juniors from the other mountains will appear less lofty. The speakers and listeners will subconsciously think the same way. This is inescapable human nature. This will be equivalent to an immortal force becoming foul and polluted, with the abodes decaying away and the deep pool holding nothing but still water. The rules and regulations will be written on paper but left to collect dust in the ancestral hall, failing to enter the hearts and minds of the cultivators. The establishment of rules and regulations by the founding ancestor of a mountain is of utmost importance, Li Lu said in agreement. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded and continued. Naturally. For example, Sword Immortal by Shang and the likes all have their own fundamental foundations, so they'll recruit disciples and spread their teachings according to their own methods. Indeed, looking at those capable of establishing sect-level immortal forces, which of them doesn't have a complete set of rules and regulations? The most important thing is who can maintain and grow their immortal force and prevent it from decaying. When it comes to the master pointing out the path and the disciples walking it, Ground-Lying Peak can be regarded as a rarely seen immortal force in this world. What's missing now is someone who can elevate Ground-Lying Peak to an even greater height. Zhang Shanfeng? Li Lu asked with a smile. It can only be said that Shanfeng has the greatest hope, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon replied. However, I hope Yuan Lingdian or some of Shanfeng's other senior brothers or senior sisters can also achieve this. Of course, when I cast my gaze over the disciples and grand disciples both inside and outside Ground-Lying Peak, I give each person a varying chance of achieving this. I won't look down on the other disciples simply because Shanfeng has the greatest chance of success. Li Lu shook her head and remarked, It's easy for you to stand here and say this, but will an Earth Immortal Cultivator and an unpolished Jade Tier sect leader be willing to think the same way? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and retorted, Have I ever forced other immortal forces to think this way? In the end, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said in a solemn voice, In any case, you need to be aware that the world will be in a dire state if all of the cultivators who reach the same level as me are unwilling to think like this. A dire state? Li Lu asked with an amused smile. What does it matter if I lose to you on this small Go board? Even if it's hundreds upon thousands of games. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon replied. However, when it comes to the vast Go board of the world, I'm not standing here and boasting, but you and the others genuinely can't achieve victory. We don't mind, Li Lu said with a faint smile. What a coincidence. We don't mind either, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said. Li Lu prepared to leave the Dragon Palace small world. The northern complete reed continent had already reached the endgame with Lion Peak, the Yang clan of the Great Origin Empire's esteemed mystery department, and the Water Dragon sect all being Go pieces. In reality, more of her pieces were random and unreasonable moves that had already been quashed. In the end, only a small number of reasonable pieces remained on the Go board. She could only pick one of the Plenty River Spirit Origin Lord or Dragon Pavilion Lord. Simply looking at the statuses of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace's Shen Lin and the Middle Shrine's water official Li Yuan, either of them initially possessed the chance to become the lofty water god. In fact, there was a stronger case for Li Yuan to become the water god. However, it was one matter for Li Lu to not mind, but it was another matter altogether for the measly water official to not mind for hundreds upon thousands of years. What was the deal with that? If it weren't for Spiritual Master Fire Dragon being willing to say a few words to Li Yuan at the beginning of the Go game, she would have launched a palm strike and shattered Li Yuan's godly body during her recent trip to the Dragon Palace Small World, letting him transform into water fortune that returned to the Plenty River. Afterward, she would appoint a new water official who was more willing to earnestly protect the Water Dragon sect. At that time, the Water Dragon sect would only feel increasing gratitude. Li Lu, let's start a new game, and you can surrender half of the game. What do you say? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon suddenly suggested. Li Lu was naturally unwilling to partake in another game. After all, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had been purposely waiting for Yuan Lingdian here, and had nothing better to do, so he had dragged her over to play a game of Go. The cultivation of someone at the peak stage of the Ascension tier no longer pertained to their heart, much less absorbing the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Many of Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's seemingly casual actions and words actually had deeper intentions, providing guidance to Yuan Lingdian in one respect, and also acting as a friend and making things clear to Li Lu in another respect, explaining the big and small threads at Ground-Lying Peak and helping Li Lu observe the human heart. However, this was the first time Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had spoken bluntly and made clear the half-friend, half-enemy relationship between them. And thus, Li Lu had made another trip to the Dragon Palace Small World. Li Yuan had obtained the 3 feet sweet rain jade tablet, and Shun Lin would most likely be promoted to the position of the Plenty River Spirit Origin Lord in the future. Shun Lin didn't dare to believe this, and Li Yuan thumped his chest and stomped his feet in regret. As for whether Li Yuan was aware that he had initially been facing certain death, with another person set to assume his position at the Plenty River's middle shrine in the future, and that he was saved by Spiritual Master Fire Dragon, and he had only obtained the Hornless Dragon Jade Tablet because of Chan Ping'an, it was very possible that Li Yuan was still muddle-headed and oblivious to these matters. To say that this wasn't good? Li Yuan was ultimately enjoying good fortune without having done much at all. He had only completed a few minor tasks, yet he was rewarded with a jade tablet that contained abundant incense offerings. To say that this was good? His inaction and lack of fight for hundreds of thousands of years had resulted in him losing the future position of Spirit Origin Lord, the chief water god of the northern complete reed continent. Die. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon remained at the mountain peak by himself, feeling quite terrible as he recalled some trivial matters from the past. There were matters pertaining to Ground-Lying Peak, matters pertaining to the northern complete reed continent, and also matters pertaining to the entire majestic world. The old spiritual master felt sleepy whenever he thought about these matters. He had arrived here from Ground-Lying Peak with a single stomp before, and he now returned to the mountaintop of Ground-Lying Peak with another stomp. Snow would fall at Ground-Lying Peak when he nodded off, allowing those young disciples to have snowball fights and amuse themselves. Zhang Shanfeng was squatting down on the plaza with a large circle of little Taoist priests surrounding him, with most of them being new faces. However, Zhang Shanfeng had always been adept at dealing with children, and the young Taoist priest was currently describing to them the great difficulty of leaving the mountains to slay demons and vanquish fiends. The little Taoist priests cheered and exclaimed as they listened, with their ears pricked up, their eyes wide open, and their small hands clenched into fists. They were all engrossed in the story and feeling as anxious as could be. Why was their junior uncle only talking about the formidable strength and impressive abilities of those demons and fiends? When was he going to talk about the whooshing peach with swords swooping down and beheading those monsters, bringing delight and satisfaction to everyone? Zhang Shanfeng stopped his storytelling and looked up, saying with a smile, "Master, you're back?" The little Taoist priests were filled with energy and spirit as they bowed in respect to their old ancestor. One of the more daring children secretly tugged the sleeve of their junior uncle's Taoist robe, causing Zhang Shanfeng to look around. The children all nodded earnestly and gestured to him with their eyes. Seeing this, Zhang Shanfeng said, "Master, it's almost New Year outside the mountains, yet it's not snowing despite the fact that it's winter. This isn't right." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon walked over and patted the head of a little Taoist priest, saying with a smile, "Then your grandpa old ancestor will put in more effort and take a nap? And I'll ask the heavens for heavy snowfall in my dreams." The playful little Taoist priests immediately nodded in unison, appearing like little chicks pecking rice. It would only snow in the mountains when their grandpa old ancestor took a nap. This was a long-standing rule passed down by word of mouth at Ground-Lying Peak, with the masters and senior brothers of the little Taoist priests making them aware. Your senior brother Yuan will leave the mountains with you to express gratitude for the answered prayers after he returns, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said to Zhang Shanfeng with a smile. Zhang Shanfeng faltered upon hearing this, saying, "I asked senior brother Baiyun to help with this matter, and he's already agreed to help me. It has nothing to do with senior brother Yuan." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and scolded, "Little bastard, you even dare to trick your master now." The jaws of the little Taoist priests dropped in shock. Their grandpa old ancestor would also scold people now? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon felt slightly exasperated, so he decided to leave and find somewhere to sleep. Zhang Shanfeng started to clean up the mess for his master, saying to the little Taoist priests in a meaningful and heartfelt manner, "Don't be like your grandpa old ancestor and scold people for no reason." A little Taoist priest crossed his arms and huffed, "Grandpa old ancestor is the most senior person in the mountain, so what does it matter if he scolds someone?" Zhang Shanfeng grabbed the little Taoist priest by the ear and lightly pulled upward, causing the little child to yelp in pain as he hurriedly stood on his tippy toes and pleaded, "Don't hit people for no reason, junior uncle. I understand my mistake." Zhang Shanfeng smiled and let go. Following which the little Taoist priest said with an angry huff, "My master said that disrespecting our elders will lead to a beating and a bruised backside, so you need to be careful, junior uncle." Zhang Shanfeng squatted down and continued to tell stories about matters outside the mountains. The little Taoist priest who had been punished by Zhang Shanfeng just then listened very carefully, and he suddenly grumbled, "Junior uncle, is there not a single good demon or ghost outside the mountains? If that's the case, then why are Grandpa Old Ancestor and the other uncle masters allowing them to do bad things?" Zhang Shanfeng smiled and replied, "There's naturally an explanation for this, and I'll let my friend explain it to you and the others when he comes over to visit. He has a plethora of interesting stories about the mountains and waters." One of the little Taoist priests furiously shook his head and exclaimed, "I feel like his stories definitely won't be as good as Junior Uncle's." Zhang Shanfeng shook his hand and said with a beaming smile, "Enough with the nonsensical truth. When it snows in a moment, I'll team up with you for the snowball fight." "No way!" the little Taoist priest cried straight away, turning down Zhang Shanfeng's offer. He had heard from his seniors that Junior Uncle Zhang Shanfeng would always be struck the most when they had snowball fights. However, he was taller and quicker, so he wouldn't get angry even when he was struck. Zhang Shanfeng reached up and adjusted his collar, asking with a serious expression, "You dare to disrespect your junior uncle? Are you not afraid of your master beating your backside black and blue?" The little Taoist priest scrunched his face and replied in a quiet voice, "Master passed away last year." Zhang Shanfeng faltered for a moment before sighing and pointing at the little Taoist priest, smiling and saying in a gentle voice, "He hasn't left yet. He still lives in your memory, doesn't he?" The little Taoist priest lowered his head, with the rims of his eyes red as he nodded and said, "Master said the same thing before passing away, telling me not to cry. Master said that he'll still be with me as long as I remember him. There's no need to think of him all the time, and just thinking of him occasionally is enough. Master also said that I'll grow up when I don't feel so sad when I think about him. At that time, I can also leave the mountains to slay demons and vanquish fiends. Junior uncle, more than a year has already passed, so why do I still feel so sad when I think about Master?" Zhang Shanfeng thought for a moment, but he ultimately didn't say anything to comfort the little Taoist priest. When he was little, time would pass day by day, and he would count on his fingers as they passed. As he grew older, time would pass month by month, and it wouldn't be long before an entire year passed. If he became a cultivator in the mountains and advanced his cultivation base to a higher level, then 10 years or even 100 years would seemingly pass in the blink of an eye. That being the case, how many of his companions could he remember? In fact, how many people could be regarded as his companions? Zhang Shanfeng had once asked his master many questions. Yet there were many times when spiritual master Fire Dragon had replied that his questions didn't have any answers. Rather, the questions themselves were an answer, and these fuzzy answers themselves were the next question. Zhang Shanfeng hadn't felt like his master was giving him a perfunctory answer, so he had ended up feeling even more confused and at a loss. Was his master's Tao power lofty? Of course not. This was because his master's Tao power wasn't atop the mountains and wasn't in the heavens, but rather in the mortal world at the foot of the mountain. "What are you thinking about, junior uncle?" a little Taoist priest asked in curiosity. Zhang Shanfeng was just about to reply. However, before he could say anything, another little child chirped quietly. "He's definitely thinking about a beautiful girl from outside the mountains in secret." "Enough with the nonsensical truth," another little Taoist priest added. And this brings a close to today's story about slaying demons and vanquishing fiends. Do come again next time, and your junior uncle will tell an even more enthralling story, Zhang Shanfeng said with a chuckle. A little Taoist priest unexpectedly turned to his companions and said, "Don't be scared. Junior uncle is definitely trying to scare us with a ghost story." Zhang Shanfeng looked at the circle of little bastards around him, each of whom was more clever and quick-witted than the other. They were seemingly harder to satisfy than the group of young juniors from before he had left the mountains to train in the outside world. Zhang Shanfeng had no option but to use his trump card, shouting loudly, "Master, why isn't it snowing yet?" The old spiritual master was sitting atop a distant cliff and nodding off, and upon hearing this he chuckled and replied, "One needs to eat before they can go to the toilet, right? The same concept applies to sleeping and snowing." The little Taoist priests all looked at their junior uncle with pitiful expressions, feeling like he wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. Zhang Shanfeng stood up and said, "So be it. I'll teach you some fist techniques first." There was a chorus of boos as the little Taoist priests all ran away. There was no snow, there were no stories, there wouldn't be any wild fruits in the mountain during winter, and their masters wouldn't beat their backsides black and blue either. That being the case, there was no point staying with their junior uncle anymore. Zhang Shanfeng suddenly saw a little child stop in his tracks, not running away with the others. This was already enough to satisfy him, and he beckoned the little child over and chuckled. "Very well. Your junior uncle will teach you a fist technique." The little Taoist priest chuckled and made a series of grunting noises as he unleashed a bastard fist technique. He then ran away, not forgetting to ask, "Have you mastered it yet, junior uncle?" Zhang Shanfeng scratched his head. This group of little Taoist priests was extremely cunning and mischievous, so much so that he struggled to keep them under control. It was evening at the small town located at the foot of Lion Peak. A young outsider dressed in azure, carrying a bamboo bookcase, and holding a hiking pole walked into a fabric shop with decent business. A woman currently greeting customers in the shop turned around and glanced at the newest customer, saying with a smile, "Oh my, it's a handsome little brother. Are you here to choose some satin for your wife's garment?" Chun Ping'an used the small town's dialect to reply, "Hi Aunt Lu, my name is Chun Ping'an, and I'm from Clay Vase Alley." The woman faltered for a moment before asking, "The Chun Ping'an whom my little Huai always talks about?" Chun Ping'an nodded in response. There were various large bags and small bags of presents in his hands, the contents of which were purchased from shops in the small town. Aunt Lu hurriedly put down the matters at hand, telling the several well-off women from the town to browse and pick the right fabric themselves. She carried a bench over for Chun Ping'an, gesturing for him to sit down as she said, "Here, have a seat. Li Huai's father has entered the mountain, so it's hard to say when he'll return. However, he'll definitely return before dark at the latest as long as there aren't any seductive fox spirits in the mountain. In any case, if you ask me, those fox spirits won't take a fancy to a blockhead like him, right? I must have been stupid and blind to fall for someone like Li Er in the past." Aunt Lu sat on the other end of the bench, appearing very familiar with Chun Ping'an as she said, "I'm familiar with Clay Vase Alley. It's quite close to the Iron Lock Well, and it's a small alley without many residents. There was a young widow living at the end of the alley, and her looks were only slightly inferior to mine. There was also Apricot Blossom Alley's Granny Ma not far away from Clay Vase Alley. You should know about her, right? The older she grew, the more vicious her tongue became. TSK, in my opinion, she could kill someone with her words alone. Even that young widow from Clay Vase Alley's Gu family couldn't beat Granny Ma in an argument." Chun Ping'an lightly placed the presents on the counter, having already taken off his bamboo bookcase and placed it beside his feet, with his hiking pole leaning diagonally against it. He turned toward Aunt Lu, smiling as he quietly and patiently listened to her reminisce about their hometown. Aunt Lu suddenly slapped her thigh and asked, "Have you met Li Lu, my heartless daughter, before?" "Most likely not, right? You might not know, Chun Ping'an, but my daughter has become rebellious and entered the mountains to become a tea-carrying maidservant for those lofty immortals. She immediately forgot about her mom and dad after entering the mountains, and she also travels outside from time to time. And what would you know? She hasn't returned home for a long time again. In any case, I won't feel heartbroken even if she's tricked away by some glib-tongued person in the outside world. I'll just pretend that I raised a daughter for nothing. However, this is a huge pity for Li Huai, who won't be able to rely on his brother-in-law in the future." Chun Ping'an smiled and replied, "Li Huai will do well in his studies. I know him well, and even though he isn't a quick learner, he has the stamina to keep going. Most importantly, he has a kind heart like uncle and auntie. This isn't something that can be learned from the books. In addition, Miss Li has become an immortal in the mountains now, so she at least doesn't need to worry about food and shelter. I believe she can definitely find a good partner in the future. I'm not being polite, and I genuinely believe this to be the case. Aunt Lu is a person with good fortune. In any case, people from small towns like us always need to look further into the future to determine who is better off and who is worse off. Adding a few pots and pans today, purchasing a large table tomorrow, and slowly adding more furniture and decorations to our houses, this will naturally allow us to live a better and better life. There was a beaming smile on Aunt Lu's face. Not only was this young man handsome, but he was also very good at speaking. Moreover, he wasn't just saying some pretty but insincere words, and even Aunt Lu felt like he was speaking the reasonable truth. In any case, he had earnestly protected Li Huai the entire time during their distant journey to Mountain Cliff Academy, so could he possibly be a bad person? Even though Chen Ping'an didn't look like a wealthy person, judging by his getup, he was already able to treat Li Huai so well, even when he was yet to become his brother-in-law. That being the case, wouldn't he help Li Huai even more when he became Li Huai's brother-in-law? Perhaps she should match Chen Ping'an with her daughter? Upon thinking of this, she started to look at Chen Ping'an with the gaze of a mother-in-law, reassessing the young man who had traveled over from far away. Very well. He was clean and tidy, and it was clear that he was an attentive and meticulous person who was understanding and considerate. She wasn't being biased against Lin Shuyi, but she truly felt like the long distance between Li Lu and Lin Shuyi wasn't going to be workable. The capital of the Great Sui nation was large and bustling and filled with beautiful women, so what if Lin Shuyi suddenly changed his mind one day? At that time, should Aunt Lu let her daughter turn into an old but unmarried maiden? Li Lu was like her mother, and she was indeed very beautiful. However, women being beautiful wasn't very helpful, especially if they accidentally found themselves heartless and good-for-nothing men. The more beautiful a woman was, the more depressed they would feel if they ended up with a heartless man. It would be even worse if they were proud and ambitious, and their lives would inevitably become meaningless and dispiriting. After 7 or 8 years, these initially beautiful women most likely wouldn't even dare to look at themselves in the mirror anymore. The more she looked at Chen Ping'an, the more she liked him. However, it wasn't the case that she changed her mind frequently. Dong Shuijing had always helped around at their house in the past, and he was naturally an honest and responsible person. However, she always felt like there was a little something missing. As for Lin Shuyi, everyone called him a talented scholar, so Aunt Lu felt like her daughter wasn't worthy. Indeed, she had heard other people mention that Lin Shui's father had once been a fairly high-ranking official in the kiln supervision office. In any case, they were a family that was able to relocate to the capital, so could the threshold to their residence possibly be low? If Li Lu truly married into Lin Shui's family, would Aunt Lu's naive and foolish daughter not feel frustrated and humiliated? At that time, might Li Huai also be belittled by the gatekeeper when he ran over to visit his big sister? Chen Ping'an obviously couldn't read Aunt Lu's mind, so he was afraid of things becoming silent and awkward as she stopped talking with a smile on her face. Thus, he actively started to make some small talk. After a while, he suddenly turned around before retracting his gaze and saying with a smile, "Uncle Li is back." Aunt Lu leaned forward and glanced outside the door, and sure enough, Li Er was truly walking back to the fabric shop. She smiled and said, "It's time for dinner, so Ani will make you some dishes from our hometown." She then stood up and hollered out of habit, "Li Er." The man immediately started to jog back. "Can't you see that Chen Ping'an has come to visit?" Aunt Lu grumbled. "You're dilly-dallying for half a day just to return home, and it's almost as if there's money to pick up on the ground outside." Li Er smiled and entered the shop saying, "I'm back." Chen Ping'an had already stood up and greeted him, "Uncle Li." Upon seeing Li Er try to sit down at his normal spot, Aunt Lu fumed, "Go and buy some wine, hey? Are you trying to save up to buy rouge and perfume for those fox spirits?" "I never have money in my pockets," Li Er replied glumly. Aunt Lu smacked the counter and scolded, "Then take some money from the drawer and hurry up and buy 2 pots of good wine. After you purchase the wine, bring Chen Ping'an to the room that we prepared for Li Huai. Think about what's missing from the room while you're out, and buy them at the same time that you buy the wine." Turning around to look at Chen Ping'an, she changed her scowl to a smile and said, "Chen Ping'an, just treat this place like your home. Your aunt will get angry if you're too polite." "I won't be too polite with Aunt Lu," Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. "A plate of stir-fried pork with bamboo shoots is a must." Aunt Lu smiled and said, "Yes, that's a certainty." Li Er grabbed some money and left the fabric shop with Chen Ping'an. Everyone was neighbors here, and the small town was also located at the foot of Lion Peak. As such, there was no need to worry about trouble arising if the shop was left unattended. As the two of them walked along the increasingly quiet street, Qian Ping'an asked in a soft voice, "Uncle Li, are you familiar with Fortune Street's Li Shixing, Li Baoping's older brother? He should be at the Northern Complete Read Continent right now." "Yes, I'm familiar with him," Li Er replied. "He visited me with a fairly strange scholarly attendant not long ago. I'll fill you in later." Qian Ping'an breathed a sigh of relief. Otherwise, it would be truly difficult for him to find Li Shixing. Li Er hesitated for a moment before looking around and eventually focusing his gaze on a certain location, furrowing his brows and launching a fist. Of everyone on the street, only Qian Ping'an was able to vaguely detect Li Er's movement. Even if someone standing nearby were coincidentally staring at Li Er with their eyes wide open, they most likely wouldn't be capable enough to catch sight of his incredibly quick punch. Afterward, a deep rumble exploded in the sea of clouds extremely far away, something that even the small town was able to hear. Li Er didn't explain anything after throwing the punch, simply saying, "Li Shixing told me to pass on a message to you before you go looking for him. He wanted to give you a peachwood talisman back then, and this wasn't a casual spur-of-the-moment decision. Of course, you didn't accept it in the end, so he drew talismans for the bamboo building of Downtrodden Mountain instead. This was in order to resolve a sizable karmic fate intimately linked with you. Thus, Li Shixing said there's no need for you to feel gratitude toward him. If you're unable to do this, then there's no need for you to look for him." Qian Ping'an nodded and replied, "Okay." Li Er arrived at a wine shop on the corner of the street and purchased 2 pots of the most expensive wine, saying, "It's thanks to you that I'm able to purchase this expensive wine." A young customer at the wine shop chuckled and asked, "Li Er, has your daughter Li Lu not left the mountains yet? It can't be that Miss Li has grown accustomed to life in the immortal abodes in the mountains, so she doesn't want to return to the dog kennel outside the mountains anymore, right?" Li Er paid no heed to this person. As they walked back to the fabric shop, Li Er nodded and said with a smile, "Your 6-tier cultivation base is very sturdy." Qian Ping'an didn't need to keep too many secrets from Li Er, so he revealed, "Senior Gu, you provided me with guidance through 3 punches at a place further east than the Plenty River." Li Er nodded in response before quickly adding, "3 punches are a bit too few." That couldn't be helped. Senior Gu was in a hurry at the time, needing to rush to Ape Call Mountain for his battle with Senior Jiyu. Qian Ping'an explained. Li Er hadn't traveled over to spectate that battle. There hadn't been any need to. "That's okay. There's enough food to eat here, and there are also enough punches to satisfy your appetite," Li Er said. Qian Ping'an thought for a moment before replying, "We can discuss that after dinner." Li Er's expression became serious in a rare sight as he looked over and asked, "I need to confirm one matter first. What are you seeking? Are you striving to become the strongest?" Qian Ping'an shook his head and replied with a smile, "I've never sought this ever since starting to practice fist techniques. There was a period of time when I thought about the notions of martial fortune and becoming the strongest due to the influence of other people, but I ultimately came to realize that these 2 matters aren't actually in conflict with each other." Li Er continued to look at Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an continued, "If I only rely on myself to practice fist techniques, then my spirit, my strength, and my fist intent have already reached their peak. However, since I know Uncle Li, I can naturally seek external help this one time. I don't care much about martial fortune, but I definitely need to break through with a stronger fist intent. Simply put, this Vajrabhati tier needs to be founded upon the pinnacle of my physique. This is all I strive for." Li Er didn't mention anything about practicing fist techniques, and he instead grinned and said, "Your Aunt Lu definitely won't allow you to go hungry. If she doesn't allow it, then I naturally won't dare to leave the table and collect the bowls and chopsticks." Qian Ping'an smiled faintly and remarked, "How good." Only at this moment did Li Er pat Qian Ping'an's shoulder and chuckle, "You can say this again after you've eaten your fill and feast on my fists." Li Er couldn't help but mumble when he arrived at the dinner table. This was only the second time his wife had told him to drink more and drink to his heart's content. The previous time was already many years ago. He saw that Qian Ping'an was purposely suppressing his fist intent, with his cheeks quickly flushing red after having 2 or 3 cups of wine. Li Er felt like something was amiss. What was this? Qian Ping'an was trying to get drunk and fall asleep so that he could avoid as many feasts of fists as possible? However, this seemed quite unlike Qian Ping'an. In any case, Li'er was very happy that someone was willing to drink to their heart's content with him. Thus he raised a leg and placed his foot on the bench. He leaned forward and was just about to grab some stir-fried pork with bamboo shoots that was placed far away from him. Yet Aunt Lu immediately glared at him and gave him a scolding, telling him to act like a proper senior. Li'er felt extremely vexed, but he had no option but to put his leg down and sit in a proper manner. He had never seen her act so pedantically in the past, and she generally wouldn't care when he occasionally had a few cups of wine to drink. This had always been the case in their household, and Li Huai had liked to squat on the bench and munch on chicken drumsticks and pork knuckle when he was little. They didn't have any so-called family teachings either, and they certainly didn't have any rules about females not being allowed to eat at the dinner table. Li'er glanced at the dish that had been purposely placed in front of Chen Ping'an, and he immediately noticed his wife shooting a glance at him. He understood what this meant. This plate of stir-fried pork with bamboo shoots had nothing to do with him. The meat dishes and flavorful dishes were all on Chen Ping'an's side, while the vegetable dishes and bland dishes were all on Li'er's side. Li'er smiled and took a sip of wine. In reality, he was quite accustomed to this treatment. This had always been the case at home before Li Huai had embarked on a distant journey to study at Mountain Cliff Academy. While Li Huai was studying at the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy, the three of them had moved to the foot of the northern complete reed continent's Lion Peak. Even though Li Lu often left the mountains to eat with her parents, Li'er always felt like there was something missing without Li Huai sitting there and causing trouble. Li'er didn't discriminate between males and females, and his feelings also had nothing to do with the kind of person his daughter was. In all these years, Li'er only had a single ask of his daughter. She should deal with outside matters outside, and she should refrain from bringing these matters home. Of course, his future son-in-law would be an exception. Chen Ping'an drank until he was slightly inebriated, but not so much that his teeth would chatter as he talked. He also had no problem walking, so he stood up and left the table and the main room, going to Li Huai's room to rest. He took off his boots and gently lay down, closing his eyes before suddenly sitting up and reorienting his boots, turning their tips toward the bed. Only then did he lie down and continue to sleep. As it turned out, he was thinking about his hometown's downtrodden mountain and his opening disciple. Li'er collected the bowls and chopsticks, while Aunt Lu remained sitting in the same spot as she suddenly asked, "Li'er, what do you think about Chen Ping'an?" "He's great," Li'er replied with a smile. Otherwise, he wouldn't have tried to privately sell the Dragon King basket and the golden carp to Chen Ping'an back then. In fact, he had even received a scolding from Old Man Yang for doing so. "Do you think this child will take a fancy to our daughter?" Aunt Lu asked in a soft voice. Li'er stopped what he was doing and replied in helplessness, "This has got nothing to do with whether he fancies our daughter or not. Chen Ping'an has already found someone he likes a long time ago. Our daughter doesn't have good fortune," Aunt Lu replied in great disappointment. Li'er smiled and didn't say anything. Aunt Lu smacked the table and fumed. "What are you smiling about? Is Li Lu your daughter or not? Perhaps you think she's someone else's daughter. What nonsense are you saying?" Li'er shrank back and replied in a muffled voice, "Our daughter is scatterbrained, and her father is also a good-for-nothing," Aunt Lu lamented in grief. "Not only that, but he's not taking things seriously either. Just what kind of sin did our daughter commit in her previous life to be reincarnated into our family to suffer hardships? Don't tell me that Li Huai will need to look after his parents, his wife, and even his married sister in the future. Didn't Dong Shuijing and Lin Shuyi Li Huai's classmates in the private school, both like our daughter from a young age? You didn't seem to care about this very much in the past, and you even felt like the scholar who traveled with us for a while was quite decent, no?" Li'er asked in curiosity. Aunt Lu shook her head and replied, "That was different. After looking at all of them, I still feel like Chen Ping'an is most similar to the private school's Mr. Qi. I can't explain it in words, but I'm very good when it comes to judging people." Li'er didn't say anything else, nodding in response before continuing to collect the bowls and chopsticks. The first time his wife had let him drink to his heart's content was when Mr. Qi had visited. "Does our daughter truly not have a chance?" Aunt Lu asked in an uncertain voice. Li'er felt slightly guilty. Later, when he fed Chen Ping'an a feast of fists, their daughter most likely wouldn't have a chance even if she did in the past, right? The next day, Qian Ping'an woke up at dawn and helped to draw some water from the well. When he was questioned by the neighbors, he simply replied that he was a distant relative of the Li family. Afterward, Li left with Qian Ping'an to take him to Lion Peak, explaining to Aunt Lu that they were going to wander around the mountain. Aunt Lu smiled widely and didn't say anything. Li was a little confused, not knowing what his wife was thinking. Li directly led Qian Ping'an to the ancestral hall of Lion Peak. They chatted as they walked, and Li thanked Qian Ping'an for Zheng Dafeng being able to work as a gatekeeper for Downtrodden Mountain. Qian Ping'an replied that this was nothing much. Li said that with Zheng Dafeng's temper, he definitely wouldn't have been willing to return to the Yang family's medicine shop in the past if he had become a cripple while traveling outside. Instead, he would sit around and wait for death, truly wasting away his entire life. If that were the case, then Zheng Dafeng would suffer a disappointing life where his master ultimately didn't look at him properly even a single time, and he didn't dare to view himself as Old Man Yang's disciple either. Zheng Dafeng was indeed despondent right now, but there was at least a master and disciple relationship between him and Old Man Yang. In reality, Qian Ping'an had always felt like Uncle Li had one of the clearest perspectives on life in the world. Looking at it again now, this was indeed the case. Mountain Master Huang Kai of Lion Peak was an old immortal with an ethereal aura. He was renowned for his combat prowess among the nascent tier cultivators in the northern complete reed continent. Li didn't make any polite small talk, and he directly told the extremely renowned nascent tier mountain master to seal the mountain. Huang Kai didn't ask any questions, immediately issuing a command for Lion Peak to seal the mountains. Moreover, there was no mention of when the mountains would be unsealed. Sealing the mountains was a huge deal for immortal forces. Generally speaking, this was only done when they were facing a formidable foe, or when their old ancestor was cultivating in seclusion and undergoing a breakthrough. Li handed the extremely respectful mountain master of Lion Peak a piece of paper, asking him to purchase medicinal ingredients according to the note. Just like before, Huang Kai didn't ask any questions. However, there was a slightly strange expression in his eyes as he looked at the young man from outside of town. If Qian Ping'an were a bit oblivious at the shop at the foot of the mountain before, then he was immediately coming to his senses now that he was interacting with someone unfamiliar. However, he didn't try to explain anything. Everything could wait until Li Lu returned to Lion Peak. Li led Qian Ping'an to the large entrance of an ancient residence at the mountaintop of Lion Peak, one that led to the cultivation abode of Lion Peak's founding ancestor. This cultivation abode hadn't been opened again following the passing of the founding ancestor, and it was only following the return of Li Lu that the residence had reopened. It was almost like another world inside, and even Mountain Master Huang Kai didn't have the right to set foot in this residence. Qian Ping'an walked inside, only to discover that it was actually a stream in a karst cave. There was a dock after passing through the water restriction at the entrance of the residence, and a small boat was moored in the dark green water. Li personally rowed the boat with the bamboo pole, steering it through the karst cave that was as bright as day, even though it wasn't illuminated by the sun or moon, nor by any glowing immortal stones or flames. The view suddenly opened up after the small boat traveled for 5 or so kilometers, and what appeared in the distance was a strange mirror that appeared as large as a lake. It was floating slightly below the surface of the lake, causing the lake water to rush over before vanishing. This mirror is the entrance of an ancient small world, Li explained. Someone wasn't very fond of this small world, so they set up this formation to continuously pour water into it. The surface of this mirror is fairly tough, and even the punch of an ordinary 10th tier martial artist of the thriving Chi tier won't be able to damage it. I managed to shatter the mirror momentarily with 80 simplification tier punches in the past, but it still repaired itself completely in the end. It said that only those who reach the final divinity tier of the 10th tier will be able to comprehensively shatter this mirror. However, I still need to temper my fist intent for a very long time before I have the chance to advance to the divinity tier. Only after that can I shatter the dead end of martial arts and truly embark on a path toward the heavens. Qian Ping'an hesitated for a moment, but he eventually couldn't help but say, "It would be such a shame to comprehensively shatter this precious immortal treasure." As for the 3 subtiers of the 10th tier of martial arts, just hearing them and remembering them would be enough for the moment. Li smiled and replied, Only when you have the power to shatter this mirror with your fists will you have the right to comment on whether it's a shame or not. It was at this moment that Chan Ping'an felt like the person standing beside him was no longer Li Er, but instead a 10th-tier martial artist. Li Er suddenly vanished from view, and Chan Ping'an knew that this was a bad sign. Sure enough, an attack rushed toward his back without warning. Chan Ping'an's body seemingly collapsed as he retracted his fist intent, not caring about his demeanor at all as he attempted to lunge forward. However, he was still unexpectedly struck in the lower back by the vicious kick, resulting in a series of loud cracking sounds that almost sounded like firecrackers. Chan Ping'an could view the physiques of ordinary Vajrabadi tier martial artists as wet paper, yet his entire body arched like a drawn bowstring as a result of Li Er's kick. Following the heavy impact, Chan Ping'an should have theoretically flown dozens of meters into the distance. However, Li Er's punch was much quicker than Chan Ping'an's momentum, and he stood to the young man's side and unleashed a downward punch, striking his arched chest. Chan Ping'an plummeted toward the ground. Li Er stuck a foot out and twisted his toes, flicking the falling Chan Ping'an onto the surface of the large mirror. Chan Ping'an felt like his breath of true qi was about to collapse, and he crashed into the surface of the mirror and bounced a few times before he forcefully smacked the mirror with his hands, leaping up and standing still. However, he couldn't help but vomit large mouthfuls of blood. Li Er was still standing on the small boat, with neither he nor the boat moving as he said slowly, "Be careful. I can't control the power of my punches very well, and when I fought with Song Chongjing in the Jewel Small World back then, with both of us at the peak stage of the 9th tier, I felt extremely satisfied and almost pummeled him to death by accident." Chan Ping'an took a deep breath, calmly rolling up his sleeves when he saw that Li Er wasn't intending to attack straight away. He twisted his toes against the surface of the mirror, and sure enough, the mirror was incredibly tough and sturdy. This feeling was the same as someone who was accustomed to the muddy paths of Clay Vase Alley suddenly setting foot on the paved streets of Fortune Street and Peach Leaf Alley. What did this signify? This signified that Li Er's punches would be painful, and crashing into the mirror afterward would be akin to rubbing salt in his wounds. It would be even more torturous than crashing into the walls of Downtrodden Mountain's bamboo building. Chan Ping'an swayed back and forth as he smiled bitterly and asked, "Uncle Li, are you going to launch 9th tier punches the entire time?" Li Er shook his head and replied, "Of course not." Before Chan Ping'an even had time to feel slightly more at ease, Li Er added, "There will also be 10th tier punches." He couldn't shortchange Chan Ping'an, seeing that the young man was referring to him as Uncle Li. Li Er felt like it was necessary to be generous. There was a huge piece of news being hotly discussed in the mountains of the northern complete reed continent. While returning to the refreshing sect leader He Xiaoyang had mysteriously become engaged in a huge conflict with the love-struck Su Xian. They should have been a match made in heaven, but not only did Su Xian's persistence fail to move He Xiaoyang, but he even managed to say something that surprisingly triggered a violent response from He Xiaoyang. The two of them circled out an area in some unpopulated region of the Tailfeather Empire, after which their fight reshaped the terrain in a radius of 50 kilometers, with the spiritual energy of the mountains and waters becoming incredibly chaotic. Su Xian had fled after suffering severe wounds, but this was not before having two of his personal maidservants directly killed by He Xiaoyang. Not only had his golden core tier maidservants been killed, but even his saber, jewel speech, and his sword, talisman suppression, had been snatched by He Xiaoyang and taken to the refreshing sect. She had then casually tossed the two paramount treasures outside the sect entrance, telling Su Xian to retrieve them if he were capable enough. If he weren't capable enough and brave enough, then he could ask his master Bai Shang to retrieve the two weapons. Su Xian entered seclusion to heal and recuperate after returning to the mountains, and it was said that his imminent and certain advance to the upper 5 tiers was delayed by at least 10 years due to his battle with He Xiaoyang. That being the case, the Great Emblem Sword Sect's Lu Jinglong would overtake Su Xian's cultivation base once he succeeded in breaking through and withstanding 3 challenges from other people, including Li Kai and Dong Zhu. At that time, not only would Su Xian's cultivation fall behind by 10 years, but even his position among the top 10 young cultivators in the northern complete reed continent would switch around with Lu Jinglong's. Bai Shang, the number 1 sword immortal in the northern region, didn't ignore this matter. However, he didn't rely on his status and immortal tier cultivation base to reprimand the refreshing sect and He Xiaoyang either. Instead, Bai Shang only offered a single remark, saying that he Xiaoyang didn't need to think about advancing to the Ascension tier, as long as he was still at the northern complete reed continent. And thus, the two sects that should have been linked by marriage were now life and death enemies. Including the Jade Forest sect, many wavering fence-sitters started to sever their ties with the Refreshing sect, with many business relationships also becoming increasingly hostile and difficult for the Refreshing sect. The Emperor of the Tailfeather Empire and many other forces in the mortal world started to secretly regret their decisions, and many cultivation talents who were initially destined for the Refreshing sect started to turn back, even if they were already halfway to the immortal force. Whether intentionally or not, many immortal forces located near the Refreshing sect started to distance themselves from the young sect that was yet to properly establish itself, strictly forbidding their disciples from having too many links with the sect. One of Heavenly Lord Xiesher's direct disciples angrily visited the Refreshing sect, yet he Xiaoyang displayed a complete lack of understanding and caused the two parties to part ways in displeasure. Afterward, the Refreshing sect became increasingly isolated, with no helping hand from any external force. Their allies were no longer allies, and the neutral forces were now potential enemies putting up barriers and roadblocks. No one thought that a newly established sect, which had deeply offended Great Sword Immortal Bai Shang, could enjoy longevity in the northern complete reed continent. Moreover, there was also internal unrest at the Refreshing sect. Half of the guest elders severed their ties with the Refreshing sect, sending out a swathe of secret letters. Looking at the ancestral hall, 5 seats were vacated in a single night. However, He Xiaoyang was also a strange person, and she didn't smash those vacated chairs into pieces. Instead, she moved them out of the ancestral hall and placed them under the eaves outside. The Refreshing sect already had few disciples to begin with, and it appeared increasingly quiet and deserted following sect leader, He's row with Sword Immortal Bai Shang. Thankfully, the 9 unofficial disciples that He Xiaoyang had recruited during her trip through the northern complete reed continent were relatively calm and composed, with not a single one of them choosing to defect from the Refreshing sect yet. In the eyes of outsiders, this was simply because these 9 unofficial disciples were completely oblivious to Bai Shang's status and might. They were even more oblivious to the immense dangers arising from the animosity between immortal forces in the mountains. The 9 disciples belonging to the first generation of the Refreshing sect's disciples following its founding were gradually brought back to the mountain by He Xiaoyang. Most of them had started off as mortals outside the mountains with no prior cultivation experience, and the range of their ages was also relatively small, with the oldest being around 30 and the youngest being around 5 or 6. He Xiaoyang recruited disciples in a very strange manner, looking at their cultivation aptitude but not treating it with much importance. It was okay as long as they could embark on the path of cultivation. What she cared about more was whether these disciples were to her liking. He Xiaoyang left the small world where she had cultivated alone. The Refreshing sect was located on a treasured land, but it didn't undertake many construction projects, only using a small piece of land on the ancestral mountain to construct several neighboring thatched cottages. The 9 disciples all lived in these thatched cottages. Only the building that was used for teaching and guidance looked slightly more extravagant, appearing similar to the ancestral halls of wealthy clans outside the mountains that were used for both honoring ancestors and hosting lectures. He Xiaoyang had only taught her disciples a Taoist mantra that didn't have any notion of level or mastery, not doing anything more beyond this. However, she did recruit an outsider to teach these disciples, and this outsider had already taught the 9 disciples at the Refreshing sect for several years even though they weren't a guest elder. This person didn't limit themselves to the mystical teachings of the Taoist scriptures, and they also expounded the knowledge of the 3 teachings and the 100 schools of thought. He Xiaoyang seemingly had great trust in this Mr. Li, not worried that his teachings would lead the disciples astray. She was even less worried that he would cause the Refreshing sect, which she had announced wouldn't recruit any new disciples for the next 100 years, to become an immortal force with no clear tenets and principles. The 9 disciples, who were temporarily still unofficial disciples, were extremely respectful toward the young Mr. Li. They only knew his surname but not his name. He Xiaoyang arrived outside the window of the lecture room. Mr. Li was teaching the poems and essays of the Confucian sect, having just explained the good points of the lines "Spring grass grows in the pond," and "The bright moon illuminates the tall building." He remarked with emotion that these seemingly direct and simple lines of poetry were the best representation of skill, causing future generations of poets to regret the fact that they had been born hundreds or thousands of years too late. Afterward, he talked about the wealthy clans outside the mountains as well as the immortal forces in the mountains, describing how the characters and demeanors of the founding ancestors could influence the traditions and teachings of a clan or force. In the end, he told the 9 unofficial disciples how they should conduct themselves to make fewer mistakes and do more good if they were to become founding ancestors in the future. One of the disciples saw their master arrive, and they were just about to stand up to bow in respect. However, He Xiaoyang extended a hand and gestured for them to remain seated, silently expressing that teachers were the loftiest beings inside a classroom. The young-looking Mr. Li posed a question for the 9 disciples to think about, after which he walked out of the lecture room to meet with He Xiaoyang. Sect leader you clearly didn't need to act like this. So be it. An outsider like me won't ask about the reasons. However, I can say with confidence that Bai Shang always keeps his word, Mr. Li said. He Xiaoyang was the direct disciple of that Taoist branch master, but there was ultimately an entire world between them after all. In any case, would the sword immortals of the northern complete reed continent care about these matters when they became angry and attacked with ferocity? Bai Shang made it clear that he didn't care about these matters. It was said that long ago, during the earliest period of the northern complete reed continent, an ancient sword immortal had once had an interaction with a disciple of the paramount sage, pointing his sword at the scholar and asking him with a smile whether he would dare to slash down with his sword. The answer was naturally yes, he would slash down without hesitation. In the end, however, that sword immortal had battled to death at the Sword Qi Great Wall, while the Confucian sage had established the Great Cormorant Academy in the northern complete reed continent. While alive, the Confucian sage had provided much care for the descendants of the sword immortal. Mr. Li, I've only been at the unpolished jade tier for a few years, so I'll need at least several hundred years to advance to the immortal tier and reach the next barrier. Bai Shang can wait if he's willing to, He Xiaoyang said with a smile. That disciple of Heavenly Lord Xiesher was quite aggressive and overbearing just then, the scholar whom He Xiaoyang had referred to as Mr. Li commented. He received Bai Shang's guidance when traveling and training in the past, meaning that he owes a debt of gratitude to Bai Shang, He Xiaoyang replied. In addition, the establishment of the refreshing sect has taken a portion of the northern complete reed continent's Taoist fortune, so this person naturally has an inclination to support Su Xian and Bai Shang. Mr. Li shook his head and said, if principles can be indiscriminately borrowed and mechanically applied like this, then I have to say that Heavenly Lord Xiesher's Tao teachings have huge issues. He Xiaoyang couldn't help but chuckle. Am I wrong? Mr. Li asked in puzzlement. To self-reflect and identify one's own mistakes regardless of the matter. This was the fundamental principle being studied by Mr. Li. He Xiaoyang shook her head and replied, I hope Mr. Li can personally say this to Heavenly Lord Xia one day. I can try if I get the chance, Mr. Li chuckled in response. However, judging from the actions of Heavenly Lord Xia and his sect, such a comment might not get a good reception. He Xiaoyang didn't focus on this issue any longer, afraid that she couldn't stop herself from laughing out loud. At the same time, she also felt slight pity for the disciple of the Heavenly Lord. She turned her head, looking at the young boy standing outside the thatched cottage in the distance. His name was Cui Ci, and he was a scholarly attendant who had accompanied Mr. Li across the continents for many years. It's time for me to head down the mountain, Mr. Li said. He Xiaoyang bowed in respect and replied, I don't dare to take any more of Mr. Li's time. Li Shixing then bowed according to the etiquette of Confucian disciples before taking his leave. He Xiaoyang stepped to the side even though Mr. Li was bowing as a Confucian disciple, evading his gesture of respect. However, she was at the unpolished jade tier after all, and she was also at her own sect. Thus, her movement was subtle and quick, and at the very least, it appeared to Cui Ci that the female sect leader had remained standing in the same spot and accepted a bow from his master. Inside the imperial study at the capital of the Great Li Empire, the small imperial meeting drew to a close. However, Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan didn't leave immediately in a rare sight. This had never happened before. Emperor Song he didn't open his mouth to ask questions. instead waiting quietly for the imperial preceptor to state his intentions. Cui Chan stood up from his chair, placing his index finger and middle finger together before lightly swiping them through the air. A long map appeared in the imperial study, showing the eastern treasured vial continent, the northern complete reed continent, and the parasol leaf continent. The young emperor hurriedly stood up and walked next to Cui Chan. During large imperial meetings, the ruler of a nation discusses current matters with his scholarly officials and military generals, not discussing anything beyond 3 to 5 years, Cui Chan said slowly. During small imperial meetings, the ruler of a nation discusses long-term matters with his subjects, with the time spans of these matters ranging from 30 to 50 years. And now, I'm going to privately discuss a matter of 100 years with Your Majesty. Your Majesty might be able to observe a part of the process, but Your Majesty might not be able to personally witness the final outcome. Just like how Father wasn't able to see the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire march across the shores of Old Dragon City? Song he asked in a quiet voice. Pretty much, Cui Chan replied bluntly. Not only did Song he not become downcast, but he even beamed with delight as he chuckled. Mr. Cui, I've actually been waiting for this day the entire time. As long as there wasn't any other official or subject present, the young emperor would always interact with the imperial preceptor like a student interacting with their teacher. There was no need for the Empress Dowager to guide him regarding this matter. When the dust settles in the eastern treasured vial continent, it's inevitable that the Imperial Hanlin Academy will be responsible for composing the records of loyal officials and disloyal officials in the various vassal states, Cui Chan explained. This most definitely isn't an undertaking that will be finished while Your Majesty is still ruling the empire, lest the records offend anyone in the imperial court. In other words, only the next emperor can oversee the release of these records. These are internal matters for the Eastern Treasured Vial Continent and the Great Li Empire, and Your Majesty can give them some thought first. Your Majesty can create a plan first, and I can review it afterward to see if anything needs to be amended or added. Mending the human heart is just as important as repairing the mountains and waters. After saying this, Cui Chan pointed at the northern complete reed continent that was located further north of the eastern treasured vial continent, continuing, What does Your Majesty think when looking at the vast territory of the northern complete reed continent? Very empty compared to the past, Song he replied. The sword cultivators of the continent had already soared to Stalactite Mountain in an impressive manner. Cui Chan nodded and said, I have a suggestion for Your Majesty. The Great Li Empire's Imperial Song clan should never think about conquering the territory of other continents. It's not possible. Song he felt slightly disappointed. He had initially thought that his teacher, the Imperial Preceptor of the Great Li Empire, would have even wilder ambitions than he had imagined. Cui Chan chuckled. Being ambitious but untalented is also a sign of internal emptiness. An awkward expression spread across Song He's face. Cui Chan then pointed at Skeleton Shoal, which was located in the southernmost region of the northern complete reed continent, and asked, If a long bridge were to be constructed between Cloud Drape Mountain and Skeleton Shoal, how does Your Majesty think this should be done? By relying on immortal coins, Song he replied with a smile. Cui Chan nodded but followed up by asking, And what is the true source for these immortal coins? Song he swept his gaze across the map, looking at the large continent to the south of the eastern treasured vial continent as he replied, The parasol leaf continent, which is destined to fragment into pieces? Cui Chan didn't nod in approval, nor did he shake his head in disapproval. Instead he simply asked, Delving down into the fundamentals, how should one earn money, and how should one spend money? Song he shook his head in response. This question was too lofty. Making sense of how to earn money is for the sake of how to spend money, Cui Chan said. Otherwise, what's the point of leaving money in the imperial treasury of the Great Li Empire? Can these mountains of gold and silver be eaten like food? This is how the Great Li Empire's Imperial Song clan can save itself after transforming an entire continent into its territory. Cui Chan raised his sleeves and pointed at the northern complete reed continent and the parasol leaf continent, one located to the north and one located to the south of the eastern treasured vial continent. He then offered his answer saying, Considering how to rightfully earn money from the northern complete reed continent is for the sake of figuring out how to justifiably mend the shattered territories of the parasol leaf continent. It might appear like the Great Li Empire is enjoying no benefit as the money flows in and out, but in reality, it will be accumulating power and wealth the entire time. At the same time, it will also receive acknowledgement from the Confucian temples. This isn't because Your Majesty or I are good at dealing with people, but rather, it's because the strategy of the Great Li Empire truly aligns with the rules and etiquette of the Confucian sect, allowing it to be pushed forward by the Great Trend. At that time, even if Your Majesty or I offend certain people with our actions, and even if these people have the ability to hurt us or the Great Li Empire, there'll naturally be sages from the Confucian sect keeping watch and punishing them once they attempt to do anything. Cui Chan retracted his hands and turned around to look at Song He, with the embroidered tiger's expression slightly cold as he continued. Me saying this to Your Majesty doesn't imply that Your Majesty is already wiser and more capable than the late emperor. Rather, Your Majesty simply enjoys better fortune and was able to become emperor slightly later, inheriting a slightly loftier throne. However, Your Majesty doesn't need to feel frustrated or angry. The previous merits and mistakes were all attributed to the late emperor, so the future merits, no matter their size, should rightfully be attributed to no one else but Your Majesty. There's no need for Your Majesty to compete with the late emperor with respect to ruling the empire. If Your Majesty can't recognize this fact, then it seems like I've said these things to Your Majesty too soon. Song He bowed and replied, "This student will remember teacher's words. The previous emperor has already passed away, and the new emperor has already ascended the throne. So will it be difficult to erase some of the late emperor's traces in the empire?" Cui Chan asked. "Head Minister Guan and the other wily old foxes will only laugh at you for being a petty emperor, but in reality, there's no need for you to say or do anything extra. After a few years, the scholarly officials and military generals of all ages will naturally come to their senses but not reveal their feelings. Becoming the emperor of the Great Li Empire and having ambitions of ruling over the entire continent, with the seas being the borders, is already a remarkable feat with no precedent in the majestic world. That being the case, it's only right to display a matching disposition and might as a ruler. You Song He will only be truly capable when the old officials from the previous rule still show loyalty and respect even when I'm not present at the small imperial meetings. Similarly, you can only be regarded as a genuine ruler for the ages when even I, Cui Chan, don't dare to regard you as a student anymore." Cui Chan paused for a moment before continuing. "These two things are naturally very difficult to achieve, but Your Majesty can give them a go. It's often said that the thoughts of rulers are difficult to guess, and this is a skill that can't be ignored altogether. Even if the rule of the imperial Song clan ends one day, future generations can still give deserved attention to Song He when they write about the Great Li Empire in the history books. They can't skip over this period of history even if they want to, and if it's not to lavish praise, then it will be to heap criticism." In the end, Cui Chan smiled and said, "I'll explain to Your Majesty some schemes and existing go pieces of the two continents. Your Majesty is the emperor after all, and I'm just the imperial preceptor.